Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the Sumter National Forest in South Carolina, during what was supposed to be a team-building retreat for our accounting firm. I've been trying to write this down for months now, but every time I start, my hands shake so badly I can barely hold a pen. The therapist says writing might help. She doesn't understand that some things are better left buried. But I can't sleep anymore. Every time I close my eyes, I see Marcus's face in those final moments. Not Marcus, but the thing wearing his skin. The way it smiled at me with teeth that weren't quite right, the way it moved with that horrible, loose-jointed gait like a marionette with cut strings. The way it spoke in Marcus's voice but said things Marcus would never say. I need to tell someone what really happened out there. Maybe then the dreams will stop. Day 1. The idea for the retreat came from our senior partner, Mr. Hendricks, who'd read some article about how wilderness experiences build stronger corporate teams. Getting back to nature, he called it, as if any of us had been there in the first place. I'd barely spent a night outdoors since Girl Scouts, and that was nearly 20 years ago. Marcus Chen volunteered to organize everything, of course. Marcus was the kind of guy who ran marathons on weekends and had opinions about the best brands of dehydrated camping food. He picked the location, a remote section of the Sumter National Forest, miles from the nearest road, accessible only by hiking trail. Nothing builds character like a little adversity, he said during the planning meeting, flashing that competitive smile that made me want to dump my coffee on his perfectly styled hair. The team consisted of 5 of us. Marcus as our self-appointed leader, Sarah Thompson from HR, David Rodriguez from IT, Amanda Foster from marketing, and me. We were supposed to spend 4 days in the wilderness, learning to trust each other and synergize our collaborative potential. Those were Marcus's words, not mine. Amanda was excited, of course. Amanda was excited about everything: new coffee flavors, reorganizing filing systems, the company Christmas party planning committee. She bounced into the parking lot that Thursday morning wearing brand new hiking boots and a backpack that still had tags on it. "This is going to be amazing," she chirped, practically vibrating with enthusiasm. "I read that being in nature reduces cortisol levels by up to 30%. Think how much more productive we'll be when we get back." David rolled his eyes behind his thick glasses. He'd brought what looked like enough electronic equipment to contact NASA, despite Marcus's insistence that we disconnect from the digital world. Sarah seemed resigned to the whole thing, checking her watch every few minutes and muttering about the quarterly reports she wasn't filing. The drive to the trailhead took 2 hours, winding through increasingly dense forest until the road became little more than a gravel track. Pine trees pressed in on both sides, their shadows creating a green twilight even in the afternoon sun. The GPS in Marcus's SUV lost a signal about 30 minutes before we reached the parking area. Just a dirt clearing barely wide enough for one vehicle. "Perfect," Marcus said, shouldering his enormous backpack. "Now we're really getting away from it all." The hike to our campsite was supposed to take 3 hours. Marcus had marked the location on his topographic map, a clearing beside Lynch's Creek, about 6 miles from the trailhead. The path was well marked at first, wooden signs every quarter mile indicating distances and trail conditions. But as we went deeper into the forest, the signs became less frequent, then stopped altogether. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" Sarah asked after we'd been walking for nearly 4 hours. Sweat stained her blouse despite the cool October air, and she kept slapping at mosquitoes that seemed particularly attracted to her perfume. Marcus consulted his map, frowning. "The trail should curve east about a mile back. Maybe we missed the turn." David pulled out his phone, but the screen showed no signal. "GPS is dead. No towers out here." "That's the point," Marcus said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. He studied the map again, rotating it to match our surroundings. The problem was, everything looked the same. Endless pine trees, the occasional oak or maple, and understory so thick we could barely see 20 feet in any direction. Amanda remained optimistic. Maybe we're taking the scenic route. I bet we'll have great stories to tell when we get back. We kept walking. The trail, if it was still a trail, grew narrower and less defined. What had started as a clear path became little more than a gap between trees, marked only by the occasional broken branch or scuffed earth. The forest seemed to close in around us, the canopy so dense that even the afternoon sun barely penetrated. By 6 o'clock we were exhausted and lost. Marcus finally admitted we might have taken a wrong turn somewhere, but he insisted we were close to the creek. "I can hear water," he said, cupping his ear. "We just need to push through a little farther." He was right about the water. We broke through a wall of thick undergrowth and found ourselves beside a creek, though it wasn't the wide, clear stream shown on Marcus's map. This was narrow and dark, the water moving sluggishly between moss-covered banks. The smell of stagnant water and rotting vegetation hung heavy in the air. "This isn't Lynch's Creek," Sarah said, consulting the map over Marcus's shoulder. "This doesn't match the topology at all." "Water is water," Marcus replied, though he sounded less certain than usual. "We'll camp here tonight and get our bearings in the morning." The clearing beside the creek was small and uneven, but it was the best we'd seen all day. We set up our tents in a rough circle, with Marcus insisting on a specific configuration for optimal safety and communication. The creek burbled softly beside us, and somewhere in the distance an owl hooted its lonely call. Dinner was dehydrated beef stew that tasted like salted cardboard. We ate in relative silence, too tired to make much conversation. Amanda tried to start a campfire with matches from the emergency kit, but the wood was too damp to catch. Even the dry kindling Marcus had brought refused to light. "Probably just the humidity," he said, but he seemed frustrated by the failure. Marcus was the kind of person who expected things to work simply because he'd planned them. David had been unusually quiet all evening, staring into the dark water of the creek. "Anyone else notice how quiet it is?" he asked suddenly. He was right. The normal sounds of a forest evening, insects, small animals moving through the underbrush, the rustle of leaves, were all absent. Even the owl had stopped hooting. The only sound was the soft gurgle of the creek and our own breathing. "Animals can sense when storms are coming," Sarah said, though the sky was clear. "Maybe there's weather moving in." But there was no wind, no change in air pressure, just an oppressive silence that seemed to press against our eardrums. We went to bed early, partly from exhaustion and partly because there wasn't much else to do without a fire. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the creek and trying not to think about how far we were from civilization. If something happened, if someone got hurt or sick, we were at least a day's hike from help, assuming we could find our way back to the trail. I must have dozed off eventually because I woke to the sound of someone moving around outside the tents. Footsteps on the soft earth, slow and deliberate. For a moment, I thought it might be one of my coworkers making a trip to the designated bathroom area, but the footsteps seemed to circle our camp, staying just at the edge of the clearing. I listened for several minutes, but the sounds stopped. When I finally drifted back to sleep, I dreamed of being watched by eyes I couldn't see. Day 2. I woke to Amanda screaming. The sound cut through the morning mist like a knife, high and sharp and full of terror. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag and unzipped my tent to find Amanda standing beside the creek, pointing at something in the water. "It's gone," she cried. "My backpack. It was right here." We gathered around her, shivering in the cold morning air. Amanda's backpack, which she'd left beside her tent the night before, was nowhere to be seen. David found drag marks in the soft earth leading to the creek bank, but the pack itself had vanished. "Are you sure you left it there?" Marcus asked, scanning the dark water. "Maybe you moved it and forgot." "I'm not an idiot," Amanda snapped. her usual cheerfulness replaced by something sharp and defensive. "I left it right here. Someone took it." "Who would take it?" Sarah asked reasonably. "We're the only ones out here." But were we? I thought of the footsteps I'd heard in the night, the deliberate circling of our camp. Had I imagined them? In daylight it seemed possible. The human mind could play tricks in unfamiliar places. Marcus organized a search of the immediate area, but we found nothing. The backpack had contained Amanda's clothes, toiletries, and emergency supplies. All gone. She'd have to share with the rest of us for the remaining 3 days. "Maybe an animal dragged it off," David suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "Bears are attracted to scented items." "There are no bears in this part of South Carolina," Marcus said automatically, then paused. "At least, there aren't supposed to be." We ate a quick breakfast of energy bars and instant coffee, then broke camp. Marcus was determined to find our way back to the main trail, but his map seemed increasingly useless. The creek we'd camped beside didn't appear on any of the topographic charts, and his compass readings didn't match the terrain. "The magnetic declination must be off," he muttered, adjusting the compass for the 3rd time. "These maps are from 1998. Things change." We followed the creek downstream, hoping it would lead to Lynch's Creek or at least a more recognizable landmark. The forest grew denser as we walked, the underbrush so thick we had to force our way through in single file. Thorns caught at our clothes and packs, and more than once someone stumbled over hidden roots or rocks. Around noon, we stopped for lunch beside a fallen tree that blocked the creek like a dam. The water pooled behind it, dark and still. Sarah was examining a cut on her arm from a particularly aggressive thorn bush when David made a discovery. "Look at this," he said, pointing to markings carved into the bark of the fallen tree. At first glance they looked random, scratches that might have been made by animals or weather, but as we examined them more closely, patterns emerged. Symbols, or maybe letters in a language none of us recognized. They were carved deep into the wood, old enough that the bark had grown back around the edges. "Probably just old hunting markers," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. Hunters mark territories sometimes. Amanda traced one of the symbols with her finger, a spiraling design that seemed to twist deeper the longer you looked at it. "It doesn't look like any hunting marker I've ever seen." As she touched the carving, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. A chill wind stirred the leaves overhead, and somewhere in the distance we heard a sound like crying, thin and keening, barely audible over the whisper of the trees. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, looking around nervously. We all had. It came again, longer this time, definitely human but somehow wrong, like a child crying, but with an undertone that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Just wind through the trees," Marcus said quickly. "Sound carries strangely in dense forest." But I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. We all felt it, the sense that we were being watched, that the forest itself was aware of our presence and didn't approve. We pressed on, following the creek through increasingly difficult terrain. The crying sound followed us, always just at the edge of hearing, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind. When we stopped to listen, it stopped too. When we moved, it resumed. By mid-afternoon, our nerves were frayed. Amanda had grown uncharacteristically quiet, jumping at every unexpected sound. Sarah kept checking her watch, though time had become meaningless in the green twilight under the canopy. David had stopped taking pictures entirely, his usually analytical demeanor replaced by constant vigilance. That's when Marcus disappeared. One moment he was ahead of us, pushing through a particularly dense patch of undergrowth beside the creek. The next moment, he was gone. Simply vanished, as if the forest had swallowed him whole. "Marcus!" Sarah called, her voice echoing strangely among the trees. "Marcus, where are you?" No answer. We searched the area frantically, calling his name and beating through the underbrush, but found no trace of him. No broken branches to show his passage, no footprints in the soft earth, no sign that he'd ever been there at all. "This is impossible," David said, his voice tight with panic. People don't just disappear. He has to be somewhere. We spent the rest of the afternoon searching, expanding our circle gradually until we covered nearly a quarter mile in every direction. Nothing. As the sun began to set, painting the forest in deep shadows, we had to face the reality that Marcus was gone. "We should stay here," Sarah said, "in case he comes back." "We should go for help," Amanda countered, though her voice shook. "Leave someone here and send the others back to find the rangers." "We're lost," I reminded them. "We don't know how to get back to the trail any more than Marcus did." We made camp where we were, a miserable bivouac beside the creek with no fire and little food. We took turns staying awake, listening for any sign of Marcus's return. But the only sounds were the creek and that distant crying, which seemed to grow louder as the night progressed. Around midnight, David shook me awake. "Someone's coming," he whispered. I listened and heard footsteps approaching through the forest. Slow, deliberate, familiar. Marcus emerged from the trees, walking steadily toward our camp. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by confusion. Where had he been? Why hadn't he answered our calls? "Marcus!" Amanda called out, her voice breaking with emotion. "Thank God! We looked everywhere for you." Marcus stopped at the edge of our camp and smiled. It was his usual confident smile, the one he wore during presentations and team meetings. But something about it was wrong. It was too wide, showing too many teeth, and it didn't reach his eyes. "I got turned around," he said, his voice perfectly normal. "Sorry to worry everyone." "Where have you been?" Sarah demanded. "We searched for hours. We called and called." "I couldn't hear you," Marcus replied, still smiling that strange smile. "The forest plays tricks with sound." He sat down beside the creek and began unpacking his sleeping bag as if nothing had happened. But I noticed things. Small things that made my stomach clench with unease. The way he moved, slightly off balance as if he wasn't used to his own body. The way he blinked too rarely, his gaze fixed and unnatural. The way he smelled, not like sweat and pine needles, but like something else, something organic and unpleasant. "Are you hurt?" I asked. "You were gone for 6 hours." "I'm fine," Marcus said, and that smile never wavered. "Better than fine, actually. I feel renewed." David was studying Marcus with the same intensity he usually reserved for computer problems. "You look different," he said carefully. "The wilderness changes a person," Marcus replied. "Strips away the unnecessary things. Makes you see what's really important." He lay down in his sleeping bag, still wearing that horrible smile, and closed his eyes. Within minutes, he appeared to be asleep. But I noticed he never stopped smiling, not even in unconsciousness. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, watching Marcus breathe. Something was wrong. Terribly, fundamentally wrong. This thing might look like Marcus, might sound like Marcus, but it wasn't him. The real Marcus was still out there somewhere in the dark forest. Or he was dead. Or he was something worse than dead. As dawn approached, I made a decision. We had to get out of here. Whatever had happened to Marcus, whatever was wearing his face, we couldn't stay in this place any longer. But when I tried to wake the others, I discovered we had a bigger problem. During the night, while I'd been watching Marcus, something had happened to our supplies. Our backpacks were still there, but everything inside had changed. Food had rotted to black sludge. Water bottles contained thick, oily liquid that smelled like decay. Electronics were corroded as if they'd been buried in the ground for years. "What the hell is this?" Sarah whispered, holding up an energy bar that had transformed into something that looked like moldy bread. Marcus sat up in his sleeping bag, that same unnatural smile on his face. "Looks like we'll have to live off the land," he said cheerfully. "Good thing I know where to find food in the forest." The way he said food made my skin crawl. There was hunger in his voice, but not for anything I wanted to think about. Day 3. Marcus led us deeper into the forest, following paths that didn't exist on any map. He seemed to know exactly where he was going, moving with confidence through terrain that would have challenged an experienced hiker. The rest of us struggled to keep up, thorns and branches seeming to catch at our clothes while they parted easily for Marcus. "Where are we going?" Amanda asked after we'd been walking for 2 hours. Her usual optimism had been replaced by barely controlled fear. She kept glancing at Marcus when she thought he wasn't looking, and I could see the same sick realization in her eyes that I felt in my chest. "Somewhere safe," Marcus replied without turning around. "Somewhere we can rest and feast." The way he said feast sent ice through my veins. David caught my eye and shook his head slightly, a warning. We all felt it now, the wrongness radiating from the thing that wore Marcus's face. Around noon, we reached a clearing unlike anything I'd seen in the forest. The trees formed a perfect circle around a space of bare earth, their branches intertwining overhead to create a natural cathedral. In the center of the clearing stood a structure that might once have been a cabin, though it was so old and overgrown that it looked more like a moss-covered hill. "Here we are," Marcus announced, spreading his arms wide. "Home sweet home." The smell hit me as we approached the ruin, a stench of decay and old death that made my stomach lurch. Bones scattered the ground around the structure, bleached white by sun and rain. Most looked like animals, but some were disturbingly large and shaped wrong. "I don't think we should be here," Sarah whispered, but Marcus was already pushing through the hanging vines that covered what had once been a doorway. "Nonsense," he called from inside. "It's perfect. No one will bother us here." The interior of the ruin was worse than the outside. The floor was packed earth, stained dark with substances I didn't want to identify. Symbols were carved into every surface, the same spiraling designs we'd seen on the fallen tree, but more elaborate, more wrong. They seemed to writhe in my peripheral vision, as if the carvings moved when I wasn't looking directly at them. In the center of the single room sat a fire pit made of blackened stones. The ashes in it looked fresh, despite the obvious age of the structure. "Someone's been here recently," David observed, kneeling beside the fire pit. "Someone's always been here," Marcus said, and when I turned to look at him, his smile was wider than ever. His lips stretched across his face in a rictus that showed teeth all the way back to his molars. Waiting, watching, hungry. Amanda bolted for the door, but the vines had somehow grown back across the opening in the few minutes since we'd entered. She clawed at them frantically, but they held fast, tough as rope and thick as a man's arm. "Let us out," she screamed, spinning to face Marcus. "Let us out right now." Marcus tilted his head, considering her with the detached interest of a cat watching a mouse. "But we just got here. Don't you want to stay for dinner?" That's when I saw them, other figures moving in the shadows at the edges of the clearing. At first I thought they might be more lost hikers, but as they stepped into the dim light filtering through the canopy, I realized they were something else entirely. They had the basic shape of humans, but wrong in every detail. Too tall, with joints that bent in directions joints shouldn't bend. Their faces were obscured by shadow, but I caught glimpses of eyes that reflected light like an animal's, and mouths full of teeth that were too sharp and too numerous. "Friends of yours?" Sarah asked Marcus, her voice barely a whisper. "Family," Marcus corrected, and his voice had changed too. Deeper now, with harmonics that made my bones ache. My real family. The ones who showed me the truth about hunger, about need, about the feast that never ends. One of the shadow figures stepped closer to the doorway, and I could see it more clearly. It might have been human once, but that was long ago. Its skin hung in tatters from a frame of visible bone, and when it smiled, I could see rows of needle-sharp teeth extending all the way back into its throat. "Fresh meat," it said in a voice like grinding stone. "Young meat. Sweet meat." "The sweetest," Marcus agreed, and when he looked at us now there was nothing human left in his eyes. They were black from lid to lid, reflecting no light, swallowing it like holes in his face. I promised them a feast. I promised them my friends. David made a break for it, throwing himself against the vine-covered doorway with desperate strength. The vines parted just enough for him to squeeze through, and he stumbled into the clearing. The shadow figures converged on him like spiders, moving faster than anything should be able to move. His screams lasted for a very long time. Inside the ruin, Amanda had collapsed to her knees, sobbing. Sarah stood frozen, her face white with shock. I found myself thinking with strange clarity about our situation. We were going to die here. We were going to be torn apart and eaten by things that had once been human, led to slaughter by something wearing the face of our friend. But I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The symbols carved into the walls. They meant something. I could feel the wrongness radiating from them. But there was pattern there. Purpose. As Marcus advanced on Amanda, his fingers elongating into claws, I studied the carvings desperately. A spiral within a spiral, surrounding a figure that might have been human or might have been something else entirely. Lines radiating out from it like rays of dark sun, connecting to other symbols, other figures. And there, at the base of the largest carving, something that looked almost like instructions. I couldn't read the language, but I understood the intent. This place was a trap, yes, but it was also a prison. The things outside weren't just hungry predators. They were bound here, feeding on whatever wandered into their domain, but unable to leave. As Marcus reached for Amanda with hands that were no longer hands, I acted on instinct and desperation. I pressed my palms against the largest carving and spoke the only words that came to mind. A prayer from childhood, meaningless syllables that somehow felt right in this place of ancient wrong. The effect was immediate and violent. The carvings blazed with sick light, and Marcus, or the thing wearing his face, screamed in a voice that shattered my eardrums. The shadow figures outside shrieked in harmony, a sound like 1,000 birds dying at once. The vines covering the doorway withered and fell away. Daylight streamed into the ruin, and the shadow figures retreated, hissing, into the deeper shadows of the forest. "Run!" I screamed at Sarah and Amanda. "Run, now!" We burst out of the ruin and into the clearing. The shadow figures circled us but kept their distance, held back by whatever force I'd accidentally triggered. I could see David's remains scattered across the clearing, and my stomach lurched. But there was no time to mourn. We ran. Through the forest, over fallen logs, and through patches of thorns that tore at our clothes and skin. Behind us, I could hear pursuit. Not just footsteps, but other sounds. Inhuman sounds, like the creaking of old wood and the whisper of wind through dry bones. I don't know how long we ran. The forest became a blur of green and brown, branches whipping at our faces, roots trying to trip us at every step. Amanda fell twice, and Sarah helped her up both times, all of us too terrified to speak. Eventually, impossibly, we broke through the tree line and found ourselves on a road. An actual paved road with yellow lines down the middle and the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen, a ranger station about a quarter-mile away. We collapsed on the asphalt, gasping and sobbing with relief. We were alive. We were out. We had escaped the forest and the things that lived in it. But even as the ranger took our statements and called for search teams to look for Marcus and David, I knew we hadn't really escaped. We'd been marked by that place, changed by our contact with whatever ancient hunger dwelt in the deep woods. Aftermath. The official report stated that Marcus Chen and David Rodriguez were lost in a hiking accident. Their bodies were never found, despite extensive searches by park rangers and volunteer teams. The area where we claimed to have encountered them was searched thoroughly, but no trace of the ruined cabin or the clearing was ever discovered. The investigators were polite but skeptical. Our story had holes they couldn't ignore. How had we become so lost when the trail was clearly marked? Why couldn't we lead them back to the location where we'd last seen our missing colleagues? Why were our supplies in such a state of decay after only 3 days in the wilderness? Amanda quit her job at the firm a week after we returned. She moved back to Ohio to live with her parents, and the last I heard, she'd been admitted to a psychiatric facility for treatment of what her family called a nervous breakdown. Sarah transferred to our Atlanta office and refuses to discuss what happened in the forest. She sent me a Christmas card last year with a note saying she was doing better and learning to sleep again. I tried to return to normal life, but normal was a luxury I'd lost in the woods. Every shadow seemed to harbor watching eyes. Every unexpected sound made me jump. I couldn't eat meat for months. The smell reminded me too much of that clearing, of what we'd found there. But the worst part was the dreams. Night after night, I found myself back in that ruin, watching the carvings writhe on the walls while something with Marcus's face smiled at me with too many teeth. I would wake with the taste of copper in my mouth and scratches on my arms that I couldn't explain. The dreams changed over time. Instead of the ruin, I found myself walking through the forest again, but this time I wasn't lost. I knew exactly where I was going. Something was calling me back, promising answers, promising relief from the gnawing hunger that had taken root in my chest. Last month I bought camping equipment. I told myself it was for day hikes, short trips to help me overcome my fear of the outdoors. But I know where I'm really going. I can feel it pulling at me. That place in the deep woods where the trees form a perfect circle and the shadows have teeth. I'm writing this down as a warning, or maybe as a confession. If you're reading this, it means I didn't come back from my trip to Sumpter National Forest. It means the hunger finally won. Don't look for me. Don't follow the old trails into the deep woods. And if you meet someone who claims to be me, someone who smiles too wide and blinks too rarely, don't trust them. Some things that go into the forest don't come back. And some things that come back aren't the same things that went in. I can hear them calling now. Even here in my apartment with the doors locked and the curtains drawn, they sound like Marcus, like David, like all the people who wandered into those woods and never made it out. They sound like they're hungry. And God help me, so am I. This account was found on the laptop of Jennifer Williams, age 32, who disappeared during a solo camping trip in Sumpter National Forest on November 15th. Her body was never recovered. The laptop was discovered by park rangers at the abandoned campsite, along with supplies that appeared to have been left undisturbed for several weeks despite having been purchased only days before. The case remains open. The end. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in Francis Marion National Forest, South Carolina, during the third week of October 2024, when the cypress trees were shedding their russet needles like dried blood across the dark water of the swamplands. I should have listened to the gas station attendant in McClellanville. Should have turned around when he looked at our hiking permits and shook his grizzled head, muttering something about hungry seasons and things that walk wrong in the deep woods. But Sarah was already bouncing on her toes with excitement. Michael had driven 4 hours from Charlotte, and Brandon had taken time off work he couldn't afford to lose. We were committed to this weekend, come hell or high water. The four of us had been friends since college at USC, bound by late-night study sessions and shared dreams of adventure. Sarah Rodriguez was our eternal optimist, the kind of person who saw sunrise hikes as spiritual experiences rather than exercises in sleep deprivation. Her laugh could light up a room, and she had this way of tilting her head when she listened that made you feel like the most important person in the world. Michael Williams, no relation despite our shared surname, was our practical joker and designated camp cook, always ready with a terrible pun and surprisingly good trail meals. Brandon Edwards rounded out our group as the quiet outdoorsman, the one who actually knew how to read topographical maps and could identify edible plants. We'd planned this trip for months, ever since Sarah had read about the primitive camping sites deep in the forest's interior, where you could hike for miles without seeing another soul. The Wambaugh Creek Wilderness area promised solitude, challenging terrain, and some of the most pristine old-growth forest in the southeast. What we found instead was something that should have stayed buried in the black water and forgotten corners of the world. The first day passed without incident. We parked at the Wambaugh Creek Trail at around noon, shouldered our packs, and began the 6-mile hike to our chosen campsite near Halfway Creek. The October air was crisp but not cold, perfect for covering ground without overheating. Brandon led us along the yellow-blazed trail, pointing out the massive bald cypresses that rose like cathedral pillars from the dark water on either side of the raised boardwalk. "Some of these trees are over 1,000 years old," he said, running his hand along bark that looked almost scaly in the dappled sunlight. "They were here before Columbus, before the Cherokee were pushed out, before anyone could have imagined what this place would become." Sarah took dozens of photos, her digital camera clicking constantly as she tried to capture the ethereal beauty of Spanish moss draped like funeral shrouds over ancient branches. Michael entertained us with increasingly ridiculous names for the various water birds we spotted. Blue herons became fancy fishing dinosaurs, and anhinga became snake birds having existential crises. By late afternoon, we'd left the boardwalk behind and were hiking through drier upland forest, following a barely there deer path that Brandon swore would lead us to a perfect camping spot. The GPS on his phone showed we were making good progress, though the signal was weak and intermittent beneath the dense canopy. "Reception's always spotty out here," he assured us when Sarah commented on her phone's complete lack of bars, part of the charm of real wilderness. We found our campsite just as the sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rust and gold that filtered down through the leaves in magical shafts of light. It was perfect. A small clearing beside the creek, elevated enough to stay dry with a natural windbreak of laurel bushes and a circle of stones from some previous camper's fire pit. Michael immediately began gathering firewood while Brandon helped us pitch our tents. Sarah and I shared a two-person backpacking tent, while Michael and Brandon each had solo shelters. As darkness crept in around the edges of our small circle of light, we cooked dinner over the dancing flames and told stories, our voices mixing with the creek's gentle murmur and the evening calls of night birds. "This is perfect," Sarah said, leaning back against her pack and staring up at the stars beginning to emerge overhead. "Just us, the forest, and no civilization for miles." She was right, of course. It was perfect. Too perfect, maybe. I should have recognized the signs even then. The way the normal forest sounds seemed muted around our campsite, how the fire kept guttering despite the still air, the strange, sweet smell that drifted through the trees like overripe fruit left too long in the sun. But we were tired from the hike, content with full bellies and good company. We banked the fire and retired to our tents around 10 o'clock, planning to wake early for a day hike to some waterfalls Brandon had marked on his map. I fell asleep quickly to the sound of Sarah's steady breathing beside me, but I woke sometime deep in the night to silence. Complete, absolute silence. No creek babbling, no insects chirping, no wind in the leaves. Nothing. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to begin. I lay there in my sleeping bag, heart suddenly racing, straining to hear anything that might explain why the world had gone so quiet. Sarah was still breathing beside me, though her rhythm seemed slower and deeper than normal sleep. Through the thin nylon of our tent, I could make out the faint glow of coals from our banked fire, but even that seemed dimmer than it should have been. Then I heard it, a sound like footsteps but wrong somehow, too heavy with an odd dragging quality as if something large was moving through the forest but having trouble lifting its feet properly. The steps came closer, circling our campsite with deliberate slowness, and I could swear I heard breathing between the footfalls. Deep, ragged breathing that reminded me of an old man with emphysema, struggling for each breath. The circling continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. I wanted to wake Sarah, to unzip the tent and check on Michael and Brandon, but some primal instinct kept me frozen in place, playing dead like a rabbit hoping the fox would pass by. Eventually, the sounds faded into the distance, and gradually the normal night sounds of the forest returned. When I woke again, it was to Sarah shaking my shoulder and pale morning light filtering through the tent fabric. "Jen, wake up," she whispered urgently. "Something's wrong with the fire." I crawled out of my sleeping bag and followed her outside, where Michael and Brandon were already standing around the cold remains of our fire pit. What had been carefully banked coals the night before was now nothing but white ash arranged in a perfect circle, as if someone had taken the time to spread it evenly while we slept. "This is impossible," Brandon said, kneeling down to examine the ash more closely. "Even if the fire had burned out completely, there should still be chunks of charcoal, unburned pieces of wood. This looks like it's been cold for days." Michael was checking his camping stove, frowning at the fuel gauge. My isobutane canister's nearly empty, too. It was 3/4 full yesterday. Sarah pulled out her phone to check the time, then held it up searching for signal. "My GPS isn't working either. It keeps saying I'm in the middle of Lake Moultrie, which is like 50 miles from here." A chill that had nothing to do with the morning air ran down my spine. I told them about the strange sounds I'd heard during the night, the unnatural silence, the footsteps circling our camp. Brandon listened with a deepening frown, then walked to the edge of our clearing to examine the ground. "There are tracks here," he called back to us. "But they're weird." We joined him at the tree line, where the soft earth showed clear impressions of what looked like human footprints. But they were too large, maybe a size 15 or 16, and the depth of the impression suggested something much heavier than any normal person. Strangest of all, the prints showed only the front half of each foot, as if whatever made them was walking on its toes. "Could be a bear walking upright," Michael suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Bears don't walk in perfect circles," I pointed out, "and they definitely don't arrange campfire ash into geometric patterns." Sarah was taking pictures of the tracks with her camera, though I noticed her hands were shaking slightly. Maybe we should head back to the trailhead today instead of doing that day hike. It was a reasonable suggestion, probably the smart thing to do. But Brandon was already studying his topographical map, and Michael was testing his camp stove to see if it still worked despite the mysteriously depleted fuel. We were experienced hikers, rational people who didn't run from every bump in the night. "Let's give it a few more hours," Brandon said finally. "Do a short day hike to the waterfalls, then decide. If anything else weird happens, we'll pack up and head home this afternoon." It seemed like a fair compromise. We cooked breakfast on Michael's partially functioning stove, broke camp, and set off on what was supposed to be a 3-hour round trip to Halfway Creek Falls. Brandon had the route marked on his map, a simple 2-mile hike through relatively flat terrain, following the creek upstream to where it tumbled over a small limestone escarpment. The first hour passed normally. We saw fresh deer tracks in the mud along the creek bank, spotted a red-shouldered hawk circling overhead, and even caught a glimpse of what Brandon was convinced was a river otter disappearing into the water. Sarah's spirits improved as we hiked, and she was soon back to her usual cheerful commentary about the forest's beauty. It was Michael who first noticed we were going in circles. "Haven't we passed that fallen tree before?" he asked, pointing to a massive oak that had toppled across our path. "I remember having to climb over it about an hour ago." Brandon checked his compass, then his map, confusion evident on his face. "That's impossible. We've been following the creek the whole time, and it only flows in one direction." But Michael was right. As we continued hiking, we began recognizing landmarks we'd definitely passed before. A distinctive stand of birch trees, a section where the creek widened into a small pool, a lightning-struck snag covered in resurrection ferns. We were following the water upstream. Our compass readings were consistent, but somehow we kept encountering the same features over and over again. "This is like something out of a horror movie," Sarah said, trying to make light of the situation, but I could hear the edge of real fear creeping into her voice. We stopped for lunch in what should have been a new clearing, but which looked suspiciously similar to several other spots we'd rested. Brandon spread out his map and GPS unit, trying to make sense of our position, while Michael and I shared trail mix and water. Sarah wandered a little ways upstream, camera in hand, following what she said was an interesting play of light on the water. "According to this, we should have reached the falls an hour ago," Brandon muttered, tapping his finger on the map. "But the GPS still says we're nowhere near where we should be, It's showing us as moving, but not in any consistent direction. Technology fails sometimes, Michael said around a mouthful of granola. Maybe there's some kind of magnetic anomaly in the rocks around here. Iron deposits or something. I was about to respond when Sarah screamed. It wasn't a playful shriek or a startled yelp. It was a sound of genuine terror that echoed through the forest and sent ice water through my veins. We dropped our packs and ran toward the sound, crashing through the underbrush along the creek bank. We found Sarah standing waist-deep in the water about 50 yards upstream, her camera floating beside her, staring at something on the far bank. Her face was paper white, and her whole body was trembling. "Sarah, what happened?" I called, wading into the creek toward her. She didn't answer immediately, just pointed with a shaking finger at the opposite shore. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just more forest, thick stands of trees disappearing into shadow. Then I noticed the smell, that same sickly sweet odor I'd detected around our campsite the night before, but much stronger now. "There was someone over there," Sarah whispered when I reached her, "watching me. But when I looked directly at them, they moved wrong, like their joints bent the wrong way." Michael and Brandon had reached the water's edge, both of them scanning the far shore for any sign of movement. "What did they look like?" Brandon asked, his voice carefully controlled. Sarah struggled for words. "Like a person, but stretched. Too tall, too thin. And they were naked, but their skin was the wrong color. Gray-green, like something that had been underwater too long." "Could have been a trick of the light," Michael suggested, but he was already backing away from the water. "Shadows, maybe a dead tree that looked like a person from a distance." I helped Sarah wade back to shore, retrieving her waterlogged camera as we went. She was still shaking, and I could feel tremors running through her whole body as I wrapped my arm around her shoulders. "I know what I saw," she said quietly, "and it was looking right at me. I could see its eyes. They were completely black, like holes in its face." We decided to head back to our campsite immediately. The day hike was forgotten, our appetite for exploration completely gone. But as we shouldered our packs and began retracing our steps, the forest seemed to shift around us. Paths that had been clear became tangled with deadfall. Streams we hadn't crossed before suddenly blocked our way, and the sun moved across the sky in ways that made no sense according to our watches. By late afternoon, we were completely lost. Brandon's compass spun wildly, pointing in different directions every time he checked it. Our GPS units showed us as stationary dots on empty map areas that didn't correspond to any known geography. Worst of all, we couldn't find the creek we'd been following all day. It had simply vanished, as if it had never existed. "This is impossible," Brandon kept repeating, staring at his instruments with growing desperation. "Water doesn't just disappear. Streams don't relocate themselves." We made camp in a clearing that none of us recognized, though it had the same eerie familiarity as everything else in this place. Michael managed to get his stove working long enough to heat some water for dehydrated meals, but the fuel ran out halfway through cooking, leaving us with lukewarm noodles and cold coffee. As darkness fell, we built a fire using dry wood from around the clearing. The flames seemed reluctant to catch, and when they finally did, they burned with an odd blue tinge that cast strange shadows among the trees. We arranged our tents in a tight circle around the fire, though none of us said aloud that we were seeking protection rather than just convenience. "Maybe we should take turns keeping watch," I suggested as we finished our meager dinner. "Good idea," Brandon agreed. "I'll take first shift. Wake me in 2 hours, Michael." Sarah had been unusually quiet throughout the evening, picking at her food and staring into the flames with an unfocused expression. When I asked if she was feeling all right, she just nodded and said she was tired from the day's hiking. But there was something in her voice, a flatness that wasn't like her usual animated speech patterns. I lay in our tent listening to Brandon moving around the campsite, feeding the fire, occasionally walking to the edge of the clearing to peer into the darkness. Through the thin fabric, I could see his silhouette against the flames, reassuringly normal and human. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to Michael's voice calling softly outside the tent. Brandon, your shift's up, man." There was no response. I heard Michael walking around the campsite, his footsteps circling the dying fire, then stopping. "Brandon, where'd you go?" I unzipped the tent fly and stuck my head out. Michael was standing alone by the fire, which had burned down to glowing coals. Of Brandon, there was no sign. "He probably just went to relieve himself," I said, though a cold knot was forming in my stomach. "Give him a few minutes." But Brandon didn't return. After waiting 15 minutes, Michael and I began calling his name into the darkness, our voices swallowed by the oppressive silence of the forest. We searched the immediate area around our campsite, but without proper flashlights, our headlamps had mysteriously stopped working, though they'd been fine the day before. We couldn't venture far from the fire. "Maybe he followed some kind of trail," Michael suggested. "Got disoriented in the dark." Throughout all of this, Sarah remained in our tent. I could hear her breathing, still that deep, slow rhythm I'd noticed the night before. When I went to wake her and tell her about Brandon's disappearance, she was lying on her side facing away from me, curled up in her sleeping bag. "Sarah, Brandon's missing. We need your help looking for him." She rolled over slowly, and I immediately knew something was wrong. Her movements were too fluid, too controlled, like a dancer performing a carefully choreographed sequence. When she opened her eyes, they reflected the distant firelight like an animal's, though that could have been a trick of the shadows. "I'm sure he'll come back," she said, and her voice was perfectly calm, completely unconcerned. "People always come back." The way she said it, with that slight emphasis on "come back," sent chills racing down my spine. This wasn't Sarah's normal response to anything. She was the one who worried about everyone, who mother henned us through every adventure. If Brandon had been 5 minutes late meeting us for coffee, she would have been calling his phone and imagining car accidents. "Sarah, this is serious. He could be hurt, lost in the dark. We need to organize a proper search." She sat up in her sleeping bag, and I got my first clear look at her face in the dim light filtering through the tent. Her expression was completely blank, emotionless, like a mask of her own features. When she blinked, it was with a deliberate slowness that reminded me of a lizard. "He's not lost," she said with that same unnatural calm. "He's exactly where he needs to be." I backed out of the tent quickly, my heart hammering against my ribs. Michael was still calling Brandon's name from the far side of the clearing, his voice growing hoarse and desperate. I caught up with him and grabbed his arm. "Michael, we need to talk. Something's wrong with Sarah." "What do you mean, wrong?" I struggled to put my unease into words. "How do you explain that your best friend is acting like a completely different person? That her voice sounds the same but somehow empty, like an echo of itself?" "She's not herself. The way she's talking, her reactions. It's like she doesn't care that Brandon's missing." Michael stared at me for a moment, then glanced back toward our tents. "People react to stress differently, Jen. Maybe she's just in shock." But even as he said it, I could see doubt creeping into his expression. He'd known Sarah as long as I had, and he could sense something was off too. We continued searching for Brandon until dawn, taking turns calling his name and exploring in expanding circles around our campsite. With the first gray light filtering through the canopy, we were able to see tracks leading away from our camp, the same oversized toe-walking footprints we'd found the morning before. But there were also normal boot prints alongside them, size 11s that matched Brandon's hiking boots exactly. The two sets of tracks led deeper into the forest, following what might have been a game trail through increasingly dense undergrowth. We followed them for maybe half a mile before they simply stopped at the edge of a small clearing dominated by the largest, oldest tree I'd ever seen. It was some species of oak, but twisted and gnarled beyond anything natural. Its trunk was easily 20 feet in diameter, and its branches spread out in all directions like arthritic fingers. The bark was black and appeared to be weeping some kind of dark sap that had stained the ground beneath it. Hanging from the lower branches were what looked like cocoons or chrysalises, pale silk constructions about the size and shape of human bodies. "Jesus Christ," Michael whispered, backing away from the tree. "What is this place?" The tracks we'd been following led right up to the base of the tree, then vanished. It was as if Brandon and whatever he'd been walking with had simply been absorbed into the earth. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the smell, that same sickly sweet odor, but concentrated here into something that made my stomach lurch and my eyes water. One of the hanging cocoons was moving slightly, swaying back and forth though there was no wind. As we watched in horrified fascination, something pressed against the silk from inside, creating the distinct outline of a human hand. "We have to get out of here," I said, grabbing Michael's arm. "Right now." We ran back through the forest, crashing through underbrush and leaping fallen logs in our panic to put distance between ourselves and that terrible tree. By the time we reached our campsite, we were both gasping for breath and covered in scratches from thorns and branches. Sarah was sitting by our rekindled fire, calmly eating what looked like trail mix from her pack. She looked up as we burst into the clearing, her expression mildly curious. "Did you find him?" she asked. "Sarah, we need to pack up and get out of here immediately," I said, already moving toward our tent. "There's something seriously wrong with this place." "Wrong? How?" She tilted her head in that listening gesture that had always been so characteristic of her, but now it seemed artificial, performed rather than natural. Michael described what we'd found. The tracks, the tree, the hanging cocoons that might have been. I couldn't even finish the thought. Sarah listened with polite attention, nodding occasionally but showing no emotional response whatsoever. "That does sound unusual," she said when he finished. "But I'm sure there's a rational explanation. Maybe there's some kind of seed pods or animal nests." "Sarah, one of them was moving. There was something alive inside." She shrugged an elegant roll of her shoulders that didn't look quite right. "Nature is full of surprising things." I was already stuffing my sleeping bag into its compression sack, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the straps. "I don't care what rational explanation there might be. Brandon is missing. Our equipment is malfunctioning, and everything about this place feels wrong. We're leaving. Now." "I think I'll stay a little longer," Sarah said, taking another handful of trail mix. "I'm really enjoying the solitude." Michael and I froze, staring at her. This was completely outside anything Sarah would ever say or do. She hated being alone in the wilderness, had never spent a night camping without at least one other person, and was usually the first to suggest heading home when things got uncomfortable. "Sarah, you can't stay here alone," Michael said carefully. "Even if everything was normal, which it's not, that would be incredibly dangerous." "I won't be alone," she replied and smiled. It was Sarah's smile, technically. Same curve of lips, same dimple in her left cheek, but there was something hungry in it. Something that made my skin crawl and my lizard brain scream warnings about predators and death. "What do you mean?" I asked. "There are others here, in the deep places. They've been very welcoming." Michael grabbed my arm and pulled me aside, lowering his voice to an urgent whisper. "We can't leave her here, but we also can't force her to come with us. What do we do?" I looked back at Sarah, who had returned to eating her trail mix with mechanical precision, chewing each bite exactly 15 times before swallowing. Everything about her posture and movements was correct but somehow empty, like watching a skilled actor who'd memorized the part but didn't understand the character. "That's not Sarah," I whispered back. "I don't know what it is, but that's not our friend." "What are you talking about? Of course it's Sarah. Look at her." But the more I studied the figure by the fire, the more certain I became that Michael was wrong. The proportions were slightly off. Arms just a little too long, neck extended a fraction too far. When she turned her head to look at us, her range of motion seemed to exceed normal human limitations, rotating just past the point where vertebrae should have prevented further movement. "Sarah," I called out, "remember that time in college when we drove to Myrtle Beach for spring break? What happened with the hotel reservation?" She looked at me with those strangely reflective eyes and tilted her head. "I don't recall that specific trip. We took so many adventures together. My blood turned to ice water. Sarah remembered everything about that trip, how the hotel had overbooked and we'd ended up sleeping in the car, how Michael had gotten food poisoning from bad shrimp, how we'd spent the whole week joking about our glamorous beach vacation. It was one of her favorite stories, something she'd told dozens of times over the years. "Michael," I said quietly, "we need to leave. Right now." He was staring at Sarah with growing realization, finally seeing what I'd noticed. The thing wearing our friend's face had stopped eating and was watching us with predatory stillness, its head cocked at that unnatural angle. What about Sarah, the real Sarah? I thought about the moving cocoon hanging from the twisted tree, about Brandon's boot prints leading into that clearing and then vanishing. I think she's at the tree. I think they're both at the tree. We have to try to help them. With what? We don't even know what we're dealing with. The Sarah thing stood up with liquid grace, still smiling that hungry smile. You don't need to whisper. I can hear everything you're saying. When it spoke, I could hear something else underneath Sarah's voice. A clicking, chittering sound like insects communicating in the walls of an old house. "You're not Sarah," I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. "Of course I am." It took a step closer, and I noticed its feet didn't quite touch the ground with each step, as if it was still learning how human locomotion was supposed to work. I have all of her memories, all of her feelings. I am more Sarah than she ever was. Where is she? Where's our friend? Safe, warm, sleeping peacefully while she dreams of becoming something better. Michael had been slowly backing toward the tree line while we talked, and I followed his lead, keeping the fire between us and the thing that looked like Sarah. Becoming what? Nourishment, sustenance for the hungry season. Its smile widened, showing too many teeth. She's honored to be chosen, as you will be. We ran, crashing through the forest with no clear destination, branches whipping at our faces and roots trying to trip us with every step. Behind us, I could hear something following. Not running exactly, but moving through the underbrush with a fluid sliding sound, like a snake the size of a person. "The trail!" Michael gasped as we leaped a fallen log. "If we can find the main trail, we can follow it back to the parking area." But every direction looked the same in this twisted forest. No matter which way we turned, we encountered the same landmarks. The lightning-struck snag, the stand of birch trees, the pool where the creek widened. We were trapped in some kind of loop, doomed to run in circles while something wearing Sarah's face hunted us through the trees. As the sun reached its zenith, we found ourselves back at the clearing with the ancient tree. The cocoons were still hanging from its branches, but there were more of them now. At least a dozen pale silk constructions swaying in a breeze that didn't touch anything else in the forest. "This can't be happening," Michael whispered, staring up at the grotesque ornaments. "This is impossible." But I was looking at something else, something that made my knees weak and my vision blur at the edges. At the base of the tree, partially concealed by twisted roots, were piles of discarded clothing. Hiking boots, backpacks, camera equipment, the detritus of dozens of camping trips gone wrong. People have been disappearing here for a long time, I realized, and no one ever reports it because they think their friends just decided to stay in the woods. Michael followed my gaze and saw the scattered belongings. Among them was Brandon's distinctive red pack, the one he'd been so proud of when he bought it last spring. His boots were there too, laces still tied, sitting neatly beside the tree as if he'd simply decided to go barefoot. "We have to get help," Michael said. "Police, search and rescue, somebody with weapons and radios and common sense." "How? We can't even find our way out of here." That's when we heard Sarah's voice calling through the trees. "Jen! Michael! Where are you? I'm scared." She sounded exactly like herself again. Frightened, confused, desperate for help. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run toward that voice, to comfort my friend and get her to safety. But I'd seen what was wearing her face back at our campsite, had heard the inhuman clicking underneath her words. "It's trying to lure us back," I whispered. "Jen, please. Something took Brandon. I saw them drag him away." The voice was getting closer, coming from multiple directions now, as if there were several Sarahs calling from different positions in the forest. But there were subtle differences in each voice. One was pitched slightly higher, another had a faint echo. A third spoke with a cadence that was just a little too fast. "Help me! I'm hurt! They're going to kill me! Please don't leave me alone." Each plea struck directly at my heart, even though I knew they were lies. This thing, whatever it was, understood human psychology perfectly. It knew exactly which emotional buttons to press to override rational thought and survival instinct. Michael was wavering, taking half steps toward the voices. What if one of them really is Sarah? What if she got away? "Listen to them," I hissed, grabbing his arm. "Really, listen." As if responding to my words, the voices calling our names began to overlap and multiply. Soon there were dozens of them, all using Sarah's voice but with slight variations, creating a discordant chorus that echoed through the forest from every direction. "Jen! Michael! Help! Don't leave! Scared! Hurting! Hungry!" That last word was spoken in perfect unison by every voice, and the hunger in it was unmistakable. This wasn't about rescue or friendship or anything remotely human. This was about feeding time. The voices began to change, losing their human characteristics and becoming something else, a chittering, clicking cacophony that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. Through the trees, I caught glimpses of movement, pale shapes flitting between the trunks like enormous moths. "The tree," I said suddenly. "That's the center of it. That's where it all comes from." Michael looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "You want to go back to that thing?" "I want to burn it down." It was a desperate plan, probably suicidal, but it was the only option I could see. We had Michael's lighter and emergency fire starter, and the forest was dry despite being October. If we could get a fire going at the base of that twisted oak, maybe we could disrupt whatever was happening here long enough to escape. The cocoons, Michael realized. If Sarah and Brandon are really in there, then we'll be putting them out of their misery. It was a horrible choice, but staying here meant becoming food for something that collected human beings like a child collecting butterflies. At least fire would be quick. We crept back toward the tree, moving as quietly as possible through the underbrush. The clicking voices had faded, but I could still sense things moving in the forest around us, staying just out of sight but close enough to attack if we made a wrong move. The ancient oak loomed before us, its twisted branches seeming to writhe in the still air. The cocoons hung like obscene fruit, and I tried not to think about what might be happening inside those silk prisons. One of them, the one that had been moving earlier, was now perfectly still. Michael pulled out his fire starter and began arranging dry leaves and twigs at the base of the tree. The bark was seeping that dark sap more heavily now, and the sweet smell was almost overwhelming. As he worked, I kept watch for any sign of the things that had been mimicking Sarah's voice. Jen. I spun around to find the Sarah thing standing at the edge of the clearing, no longer bothering to disguise its true nature. Its limbs were elongated and insect-like. Its skin had taken on a mottled gray-green coloration, and its mouth was full of needle-sharp teeth. But its eyes were still Sarah's eyes, brown and warm and filled with terrible awareness. "Please don't burn the tree," it said in Sarah's voice, though the mouth movements didn't match the words. "She's still in there. They're both still in there, and they're dreaming such beautiful dreams." "Yitiu, what are you?" I demanded, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "We are the children of the hungry season," it replied. "We are what comes when the barriers grow thin and the old agreements are forgotten. We are what feeds on those who wander too far from the light." Behind it, other shapes were emerging from the forest. Tall, pale things that moved like broken marionettes. Some still wore ragged human clothing, while others had shed any pretense of humanity entirely. All of them had those same wrong proportions, those same needled teeth. "For so long we starved in the deep places," the Sarah thing continued. "But now there are so many of you, So many who seek solitude in the wilderness. You make it easy for us." Michael had gotten a small fire started among the leaves, and it was beginning to spread up the trunk of the tree. The creatures surrounding us began to make distressed sounds, clicking and chittering in apparent agony as the flames caught hold. "The tree is our heart," the Seraphim said, its voice becoming more urgent. "Destroy it, and you destroy the dreams. Is that what you want? To murder your friends while they sleep?" "They're already dead," I said, though the words tasted like ashes in my mouth. "No, they're becoming something better, something that doesn't know hunger or fear or loneliness. Join them, Jen. Let us take away all your pain." For a moment, I was tempted. The promise of an end to suffering, to the constant struggle of human existence, was almost irresistible. But then I looked at the creature wearing my best friend's face and remembered Sarah's laugh, her terrible jokes, the way she'd worried about everyone she cared about. That person deserved better than to become food for these things. "Go to hell," I said, and threw a handful of dry leaves onto Michael's growing fire. The effect was immediate and horrifying. The creatures began screaming, not with voices but with that same chittering sound amplified to a volume that made my ears ring. The Seraphim's face contorted into something that was neither human nor insect, but a nightmare fusion of both. "You don't understand what you're doing," it shrieked. "The tree holds more than just your friends. It holds everything we've collected over the centuries. Destroy it, and you release them all." I hesitated, suddenly uncertain. What if it was telling the truth? What if burning the tree would unleash something even worse? But Michael had no such doubts. He was feeding larger branches to the fire, which was now climbing the trunk and beginning to reach the lower cocoons. "Whatever happens, it has to be better than this." The first cocoon caught fire, burning with an unnatural blue flame that cast dancing shadows across the clearing. From inside came a sound that might have been screaming, or might have been the release of held breath. The other creatures were backing away from the fire, but I could see more of them emerging from the forest. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. "They're going to try to stop us," I warned Michael. "Let them try." But instead of attacking, the creatures began to collapse. As the fire spread up the tree and more cocoons caught flame, the pale things fell to the ground one by one, their elongated limbs twitching and then going still. The Seraphim was the last to fall, and as it did, its features shifted back toward human normal. "Thank you," it whispered in Sarah's real voice, and then it was gone. The fire spread quickly through the ancient tree, which burned like it was soaked in gasoline despite the dark sap. Within minutes, the entire massive trunk was engulfed in blue-white flames that reached toward the sky like a beacon. The heat was intense enough that we had to back away to the far edge of the clearing. As the tree burned, things began to emerge from the flames, translucent shapes that might have been human souls or might have been my oxygen-deprived imagination. They rose into the afternoon sky like smoke, finally free of whatever had been holding them prisoner in that twisted wood. The fire burned for hours, reducing the ancient oak to nothing but ash and charred earth. When it finally died down, the forest around us looked different, brighter somehow, as if a shadow that had been covering everything for years had finally lifted. We found our way out easily after that. The trails were where they should be. Our compass pointed true north, and within 3 hours we were back at the parking area where Michael's car sat exactly where we'd left it 4 days ago. 4 days. It had felt like weeks. The drive home was mostly silent. What could we say? Who would believe us? Even the physical evidence was ambiguous. We had no photos of the creatures, no samples of the tree's sap, nothing but our testimony and the fact that Sarah Rodriguez and Brandon Edwards had vanished without a trace in Francis Marion National Forest. The police were polite but ultimately useless. They organized search parties, brought in dogs and helicopters, but found nothing. The clearing where the tree had stood was just an empty circle of scorched earth that could have been caused by lightning or a careless camper's fire. There were no human remains, no cocoons, no sign that anything unusual had ever happened there. Sarah's and Brandon's families held memorial services after the searches were called off. Michael and I attended, said the right words, accepted condolences from people who had no idea what had really happened to our friends. We told the sanitized version of events. They'd gotten separated from us during a hike. We'd searched but couldn't find them. We'd assumed they'd made it back to the trail head ahead of us. It was easier than the truth. It was also a lie that ate at us both. Michael moved to Oregon 6 months later, said he needed a change of scenery. We keep in touch via email occasionally, but we never talk about what happened in Francis Marion. What would be the point? We saved each other, maybe saved other people from suffering the same fate as Sarah and Brandon, but we couldn't save our friends. I still hike, though never alone and never in South Carolina. I've become that paranoid camper who checks and double-checks everything, who carries redundant navigation equipment and never trusts technology completely. My friends think it's quirky outdoor anxiety, and I let them believe that. Sometimes, late at night in my tent, I hear things moving in the forest around my campsite. Footsteps that don't quite match human gaits, breathing that sounds too deep and too slow. I tell myself it's just normal wildlife, maybe a deer or a bear passing through. But I always keep my fire burning bright, and I never, ever follow strange sounds into the darkness. Because I learned something in Francis Marion that I'll never forget. There are hungry things in the deep places of the world, and they're always looking for new dreams to collect. The barriers between their realm and ours are thinner than we like to believe, especially in places where few people go and fewer still return. Sarah and Brandon are gone, consumed by something that should have stayed buried in folklore and nightmare. But sometimes, when I'm hiking in particularly remote areas, I catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Tall, pale shapes flitting between trees, always just out of direct sight. And sometimes, just sometimes, I hear Sarah's voice calling my name from deep in the forest, asking me to come and see the beautiful dreams she's learned to dream. I never answer. I never will. But the fact that I still hear her means the hungry season isn't over. It's just waiting for the next group of hikers to wander too far from the light, too deep into places where old things sleep, and patient predators collect human souls like butterflies pinned to boards. The forest remembers everything, and in Francis Marion, something is always hungry. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in Congaree National Park, South Carolina, during what should have been the most romantic weekend of our marriage. Michael and I had been planning this anniversary trip for months. 3 years married, and we'd never done anything like it, just the two of us completely off-grid in one of the few remaining old-growth forests on the East Coast. No cell service, no distractions. Just us and 26,000 acres of bottomland hardwood forest that had stood unchanged since before European settlers ever set foot in the Carolinas. I should have paid attention to the warnings. You sure about this place?" the ranger at the visitor center had asked, her weathered face creased with concern as she stamped our backcountry permit. "Congaree's beautiful, don't get me wrong, but it's not like other parks. Gets real dark in there, real fast. And the old-timers around here?" She'd trailed off, shaking her head. "Well, they got stories." Michael had laughed it off. "Stories like what?" The ranger's eyes had gone distant. "Gula folk been living around these parts for centuries. They say the cypress trees got memory. Say some things that go into those swamps. They don't come out the same." I'd felt a chill then, but Michael was already folding the trail map, his excitement infectious. "Sounds perfect for a horror writer," he'd said, squeezing my hand. "Maybe you'll get some inspiration." If only I'd known. We'd chosen the Weston Lake Loop for our 2-day backpacking trip, 8 miles through some of the most pristine wilderness left in the state. The trail would take us deep into the heart of the floodplain, where bald cypress trees older than Christianity stood sentinel in dark water, their knees jutting up like the arthritic fingers of buried giants. The morning we set out, everything felt perfect. October in South Carolina meant the oppressive summer heat had finally broken, leaving behind crisp air that smelled of decomposing leaves and cypress bark. Spanish moss hung from every branch like tattered funeral shrouds, but in the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy, it looked magical rather than ominous. Michael was in his element. He'd been an Eagle Scout, had done wilderness survival courses in college, and took every opportunity to remind me of his outdoors expertise. Not in a condescending way, that wasn't Michael's style, but with the gentle enthusiasm of someone sharing something he truly loved. "Look at the size of these trees," he said as we hiked deeper into the forest, his voice hushed with reverence. "Some of these cypress trees are over 1,000 years old. They were here when the Vikings were raiding Europe." I loved watching him like this, his face animated with wonder as he pointed out bird species and explained the complex ecosystem of the floodplain. It reminded me why I'd fallen for him in the first place, his ability to find magic in the world, to make me see beauty I would have missed on my own. The trail was well marked at first, wooden boardwalks carrying us over the frequent wetlands and creek crossings, but as we ventured deeper, the maintained path gave way to muddy trails marked only by occasional blazes on tree trunks. The canopy grew thicker overhead, blocking out more and more sunlight until we were walking through a perpetual twilight, even though it was only mid-afternoon. "Getting kind of dark in here," I said, trying to keep my voice light. I'd always been slightly claustrophobic, and something about the dense canopy pressing down above us was making my chest tight. "It's supposed to be like this," Michael assured me, consulting the map. "We're in the heart of the floodplain now. The tree cover is so thick here that it stays dim even at noon." I nodded, but couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the undergrowth made me turn my head. The forest was alive with sound. Birds calling from invisible perches, the splash of something large moving through distant water, the constant drip and gurgle of the wetlands, but somehow it all felt muffled and wrong, like listening to the world through cotton. We stopped for lunch by Cedar Creek, a dark ribbon of water that reflected nothing but shadows. Michael spread out our map on a fallen log, tracing our route with his finger. "We should hit our campsite by 4, he said. "Weston Lake. According to this, there's a platform right on the water." I bit into my granola bar and immediately spit it out. It tasted like mold, earthy and rotten. "This is gross," I said, checking the wrapper. The expiration date was still good, but when I opened the package fully, I saw that the bar was covered in a fine layer of white fuzz. "That's weird," Michael said, examining his own bar. It looked normal, golden brown and intact. "Mine's fine." I shrugged it off and ate some trail mix instead, but the incident left me unsettled. I'd packed that food myself just the night before. There was no way it should have gone bad so quickly. We resumed hiking, but now I was hyper-aware of every smell, every taste in the air. The forest had its own scent, rich earth, decaying vegetation, the mineral smell of dark water, but underneath it all was something else. Something that reminded me of the time a mouse had died in the walls of our apartment, and we'd spent weeks trying to locate the source of the stench. "Do you smell that?" I asked Michael as we navigated around a particularly large cypress, its base swollen into a massive buttress that rose from standing water. He paused, sniffing the air. "Smell what?" "Like something rotting." Michael shrugged. "It's a swamp, Jen. Things die and decompose here all the time. It's part of the ecosystem." But this wasn't the clean decay of autumn leaves or fallen branches. This was the cloying, sweet stench of corruption, and it seemed to be getting stronger as we hiked deeper into the forest. The trail became increasingly difficult to follow. What had started as a clear path marked with blue blazes had deteriorated into a barely visible track that seemed to split and merge at random. Michael kept consulting the map, but I could see the growing confusion on his face. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, stopping at what appeared to be a three-way fork in the trail. "According to the map, this should be a straight shot to the lake." I pulled out my phone to check our GPS location, but the screen showed nothing but a spinning wheel. "No signal," I said. not even for location services. "That's normal out here," Michael said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "We'll figure it out. The lake can't be far." We chose the middle path, but within minutes it had faded to nothing, leaving us standing in thick undergrowth with no visible trail in any direction. The trees pressed close around us, their trunks so wide that 3 people holding hands couldn't have encircled them. Spanish moss hung down like curtains, blocking our view in every direction. "Michael," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice, "I think we're lost." He was studying the map again, turning it in different directions as if that would make the landscape match the markings on the paper. "We can't be lost," he said. "We've been following the trail the whole time." But even as he said it, I could see him looking around with growing alarm. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, a maze of massive trees and black water that all looked exactly the same. The canopy above us was so thick that no sunlight penetrated at all now. We might as well have been hiking in a cave. "Let's backtrack," I suggested. "Find where we lost the trail." We turned around and started walking back the way we'd come, but within minutes I realized we were completely turned around. Nothing looked familiar. The trees that had seemed like landmarks before now blended together in an endless repetition of moss-draped trunks and standing water. "This is impossible," Michael said, his voice tight with frustration. "We've only been off the trail for 10 minutes. How can everything look different?" That's when we heard the sound. It started as a low humming, almost like the vibration of power lines, but there were no power lines in Congaree. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, resonating through the trees and up from the dark water at our feet. "What is that?" I whispered. Michael had gone very still, his head cocked to one side. "I don't know." The humming grew louder, and now I could make out what sounded almost like voices. Not words exactly, but modulated tones that rose and fell in patterns that felt almost like language. The hair on my arms stood up. "We need to keep moving," Michael said, his voice steady but urgent. "Find the trail. Find the campsite." We stumbled forward through the undergrowth, but the humming followed us, always just at the edge of perception. Sometimes it would fade until I thought it had stopped entirely. Then it would return, closer and more distinct. Once I could have sworn I heard my own name being called from somewhere deep in the trees. The light was fading fast now, though whether it was evening approaching or simply the forest growing denser, I couldn't tell. My phone was completely dead. Not just out of signal, but powered down despite having been fully charged that morning. "Look," Michael said suddenly, pointing ahead. "Water." Through the trees, I could see the dark gleam of a large body of water. Weston Lake. We'd found our campsite after all. Relief flooded through me as we pushed through the last of the undergrowth and emerged onto a small clearing beside the lake. There was even a wooden platform, just as the map had promised, though it looked older and more weathered than I'd expected. "Thank God," I said, dropping my pack. "I was starting to think we'd be wandering around out here all night." Michael was already setting up camp with practiced efficiency, stringing our tarp between 2 trees and unrolling our sleeping bags on the platform. "See?" he said with a grin. "I told you we'd find it." But something felt wrong about the clearing. It was too quiet. Even the constant background noise of the forest had faded to an unnatural silence. The lake stretched out before us, perfectly still and black as oil. No insects buzzed in the air, no birds called from the trees. It was as if we'd entered a dead zone where nothing lived. "Shouldn't there be more wildlife around the water?" I asked, settling down beside our camp stove as Michael tried to light it. "Maybe we're scaring them off," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. He clicked the igniter again and again, but the flame wouldn't catch. "That's weird. This thing was working fine this morning." I watched him fiddle with the stove, adjusting the gas flow and checking the connections, but nothing worked. Finally, he gave up and started gathering deadwood for a fire instead. "We'll cook over open flame," he said. "More romantic anyway." But the fire wouldn't light either. Michael tried match after match, building careful tinder nests and arranging kindling exactly the way he'd been taught, but every flame guttered out within seconds. Even when he managed to get the tinder smoking, it would die away without catching the larger wood. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, striking another match. "This wood is bone dry." When the match finally caught and held, the flame burned an unnatural blue-white color that cast weird shadows across the clearing. I stared at it, mesmerized and disturbed. Fire wasn't supposed to look like that. "Michael," I said slowly, "that's not normal." He looked up from where he was feeding twigs into the strange flame. In the blue light, his face looked gaunt and unfamiliar. "What do you mean?" "The color. Fire isn't supposed to be blue like that." Michael glanced down at the flames, then back at me with a puzzled expression. "It looks normal to me." A chill ran down my spine. The flames were clearly blue, an electric, unnatural blue that hurt to look at directly. How could he not see it? "I think there's something wrong with this place," I said, scooting closer to him. "Maybe we should pack up and try to find another campsite." "Jen, we've been hiking all day. It's getting dark and we don't even know exactly where we are. We're not going anywhere tonight." He was right, of course. Even if I could convince him that something was wrong here, we couldn't navigate the forest in complete darkness. We were stuck. I forced myself to eat some of our dehydrated camping food, though it tasted like ash in my mouth. Michael seemed to have no trouble with his meal, chatting about the day's hike and making plans for tomorrow as if everything was perfectly normal. But I couldn't take my eyes off that blue fire, or shake the feeling that we were being watched from the dark trees surrounding our clearing. When it came time for bed, I zipped myself into my sleeping bag but couldn't bring myself to close my eyes. The silence was absolute now. No wind, no water lapping at the shore, no night sounds of any kind. It was the silence of the grave. Michael fell asleep easily beside me, his breathing deep and regular. I envied him that. Every shadow seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at it, and more than once I thought I saw pale shapes drifting between the trees at the edge of our firelight. I must have dozed eventually, because I woke with a start to find the fire burned down to coals and Michael's sleeping bag empty beside me. "Michael," I called softly, sitting up and looking around the clearing. No answer. I found his boots still lined up neatly at the foot of the platform, which meant he'd left barefoot. Who goes hiking barefoot in the middle of the night? "Michael!" I called louder, but my voice seemed to die just beyond the edge of the clearing. The silence swallowed it completely. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed out of my sleeping bag, my bare feet hitting the wooden platform with a dull thud. The beam of my light seemed weaker than it should have been, barely penetrating the darkness beyond our camp. "Michael, where are you?" I stepped off the platform and into the forest, following what might have been footprints in the soft earth. The beam of my flashlight flickered and dimmed with every step, until I was practically feeling my way through the trees. That's when I heard the humming again. It was coming from deeper in the forest, the same wordless modulation I'd heard earlier, but now it was accompanied by another sound, a wet, rhythmic slapping like someone walking through shallow water. The sounds were moving away from me, leading me deeper into the trees. I followed, though every instinct screamed at me to turn back. The humming grew louder and more complex, and now I could definitely hear Michael's voice mixed in with the other sounds. Not words, just that same strange tonal modulation. The trail led me to another small clearing beside the lake, though I was sure I'd never seen this spot before. Moonlight filtered down through a gap in the canopy, illuminating a scene that made my blood turn to ice. Michael stood waist-deep in the dark water, completely naked, his arms raised above his head. He was humming along with the other voices, swaying back and forth in a rhythm that seemed to match the movement of the water around him. But it wasn't just the water moving. There were shapes in the lake, pale forms that rippled just beneath the surface. "Michael," I called, but he didn't respond. He seemed completely entranced, lost in whatever ritual he was performing. I waded into the water toward him, and that's when I saw his face. His eyes were completely black, not just the pupils but the entire eye, as if they'd been filled with ink. And he wasn't blinking, at all. just staring straight ahead with those terrible empty eyes while he hummed along with the voices from the lake. "Michael, what are you doing? Come back to camp." He turned toward me then, still not blinking, and smiled. But it wasn't Michael's smile. It was too wide, stretching his mouth into an unnatural rictus that showed too many teeth. "Jennifer," he said, but his voice was wrong, too deep, with an odd echo as if he were speaking from the bottom of a well. "Come into the water. It's beautiful here." "No." I backed away, water splashing around my legs. "Michael, this isn't you. Something's wrong." His head tilted to one side, that horrible smile never wavering. "I am Michael. I am exactly Michael. Come into the water, Jennifer. Let them show you what I've seen." The pale shapes in the lake were moving closer now, rising toward the surface. I caught glimpses of what might have been faces, or things that had once been faces, drifting just below the waterline. The humming grew louder, more insistent, and I felt a strange compulsion to walk deeper into the lake, to join whatever communion was taking place there. Instead, I turned and ran. I crashed through the forest in complete panic, branches tearing at my clothes and roots catching my feet. Behind me, I could hear Michael, or the thing that looked like Michael, calling my name in that wrong voice, promising that it would be beautiful, that I would understand once I let them in. Somehow, I found our campsite. I threw my belongings into my pack with shaking hands, not bothering to organize anything properly. I had to get out of this place. Had to find help. Had to. "Jennifer." I spun around to find Michael standing at the edge of the clearing, still naked, still smiling that terrible smile. But now I could see other changes. His skin had a grayish pallor, and there were dark veins visible beneath the surface, spreading up from his feet like infection. When he moved, it was with a fluid, boneless grace that was completely unlike his normal gait. "Where are you going?" he asked, tilting his head again. "We haven't finished our communion." "Stay away from me," I said, backing toward the opposite side of the clearing. "You're not Michael." "I am Michael," the thing insisted, taking a step closer. "I have all his memories, all his love for you. I know about the scar on your knee from when you fell off your bike when you were 7. I know you're afraid of spiders, but you pretend not to be because you think it makes you seem weak. I know you cry during romantic comedies, but only when you think I'm not looking." The details were perfect, intimate knowledge that only Michael could have possessed. For a moment, I almost believed it was really him, that maybe I was having some kind of breakdown, hallucinating horrors where none existed. Then it smiled again, and I saw that its teeth had changed. They were pointed now, sharp as needles, and behind them I caught a glimpse of something that moved like it was alive. "I know you want children," it continued, moving closer with that unnatural glide. "I know you're afraid I don't want them as much as you do. But I do want them, Jennifer. I want to fill you with them. Beautiful children that will understand the lake as I do now." I bolted. The forest was a nightmare of shadows and grasping branches, but I ran anyway, my flashlight beam dancing wildly as I stumbled over roots and splashed through hidden streams. Behind me, I could hear the thing that wore Michael's face giving chase, but it wasn't running. It was flowing through the trees with impossible speed, never quite catching up, but never falling behind either. The trail was impossible to find in the darkness, but I didn't care. I just needed distance, needed to get away from that clearing and whatever had taken my husband. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, then I ran some more. Dawn found me collapsed against the base of an enormous cypress, my clothes torn and muddy, my hands scratched bloody from pushing through brambles. The forest looked different in the pale morning light, more normal, less oppressive. Birds were calling from the canopy, and I could hear the ordinary sounds of a swamp waking up. But I was completely lost. I had no idea which direction I'd run during the night, no landmarks to guide me back to any recognizable trail. My phone was still dead, my map was back at the campsite with the rest of my gear, and I had nothing but the clothes on my back and a rapidly dying flashlight. I picked a direction and started walking, hoping to find the trail or at least the lake, which might lead me back to civilization. But every cypress looked the same, every stretch of black water identical to the last. The forest had become a maze, and I was lost at its heart. That's when I heard Michael calling my name. "Jennifer, Jennifer, where are you?" The voice sounded normal now, concerned, frightened, completely human. I almost called back before I remembered those black eyes, that impossible smile. It had to be the same creature, trying a new approach. "I'm hurt, Jen. I need help." The voice was coming from my left, maybe 100 yards away. I crept in that direction, moving as quietly as I could through the undergrowth. I found him sitting against a tree, his clothes torn and muddy just like mine. There was a deep gash across his forehead, dried blood matting his hair, and when he looked up at me his eyes were normal, brown and familiar and full of pain. "Thank God," he said when he saw me. "I've been looking for you all night. What happened? I woke up and you were gone." I stared at him, trying to reconcile this injured, frightened man with the thing I'd encountered at the lake. Had I imagined it all? Had some kind of stress-induced psychosis made me hallucinate the entire episode? "You don't remember?" I asked carefully. Michael shook his head, wincing at the movement. "I remember going to sleep, then waking up alone. I've been searching for you ever since. I must have hit my head on a branch in the dark." He looked so much like himself, vulnerable and hurt and worried about me. Every detail was perfect, from the way he held his left shoulder slightly higher than his right to the small scar on his chin from a childhood accident. If this was an imposter, it was a flawless one. "Jen, you're scaring me. What's wrong?" "Last night," I said slowly, "you left the campsite. I found you in the lake." "What lake? Our campsite was just by the platform. There wasn't any lake nearby." But there had been. I was sure of it. We'd camped right beside Weston Lake, had seen it clearly through the trees. Unless— "Show me where you think our campsite is," I said. Michael struggled to his feet, favoring his left leg, and led me through the trees. Within minutes, we emerged into a clearing with a wooden platform. But it wasn't the same place. This platform was newer, in better repair, and it sat beside a small creek rather than a lake. "See?" Michael said. "No lake." I stared at the clearing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It looked like our campsite, but wrong, somehow, like a movie set designed to approximate the real thing but missing crucial details. Our gear was scattered around the platform as if we'd left in a hurry, but I didn't remember packing up. "I don't understand," I said. "This isn't where we camped." Michael sat down heavily on the platform, pressing a hand to his forehead. "Jen, I think you might have had some kind of episode. Sleepwalking, maybe, or a panic attack. You've been under a lot of stress lately with the book deadline and everything." It would have been so easy to believe him, to accept that I'd had some kind of breakdown, that the horrors I remembered were nothing more than stress-induced hallucinations. The alternative, that something had taken my husband's place, that it was sitting right beside me wearing his face, was too terrible to contemplate. But I couldn't forget those black eyes, the unnatural smile, the feeling of wrongness that had permeated everything about the creature in the lake. "You're right," I said, forcing my voice to sound calm. "I think I did have some kind of panic attack. I'm sorry I scared you." Michael's face flooded with relief. "It's okay, baby. Let's just pack up and get out of here. We can come back another time when you're feeling better." He stood up and started gathering our scattered gear, moving with his normal, familiar grace. Nothing fluid or boneless about his movements now. Maybe I really had imagined it all. We packed in silence, Michael occasionally wincing when he moved too quickly. The cut on his forehead looked genuine, deep enough to have bled considerably, with edges that were already starting to scab over. Impossible to fake, surely. As we shouldered our packs and prepared to leave the clearing, Michael turned to me with a gentle smile. "I love you, Jen. No matter what happens, no matter what you're going through, I love you." It should have been comforting. It should have made me feel safe and loved and protected. Instead, it made my skin crawl. Because Michael never called me baby. Never. In 3 years of marriage, he'd never once used that endearment. He always called me Jen, or Jennifer when he was being formal, or sometimes Love when he was feeling particularly affectionate, but never baby. I followed him out of the clearing, my mind racing. If this wasn't Michael, then what had happened to my real husband? Was he dead? Transformed? Still trapped somewhere in that lake I couldn't find again? The thing wearing Michael's face led us confidently through the forest, never hesitating at trail junctions or consulting the map. Within an hour, we'd found the main boardwalk trail that led back to the visitor center. Impossible. We'd been completely lost just minutes before. "How did you know which way to go?" I asked as we walked across the familiar wooden planks. "Lucky guess," Michael said, but he didn't turn around to answer. Besides, all trails lead somewhere eventually. That wasn't true, and the real Michael would have known it. Trails in wilderness areas often petered out into nothing, or formed loops that could keep hikers walking in circles for days. But I didn't argue. I just followed and tried to figure out what I was going to do. By the time we reached the parking lot, I'd made my decision. Whatever this thing was, I couldn't let it come home with me. I couldn't let it into my life, into my bed, into my body to fill me with beautiful children, as it had promised. "I think I left something back there," I said as we reached our car. "My journal. It must have fallen out of my pack." "We can replace it," Michael said, but I was already backing away. "No, it has all my notes for the new book. I need it. Just give me 20 minutes. Before he could protest, I turned and ran back toward the forest. Behind me, I heard him calling my name, but I didn't stop. I ran until I reached the visitor center, then burst through the doors with wild eyes and muddy clothes. "Help me," I gasped to the startled ranger behind the desk. "Something happened to my husband. Something took him." The ranger, a different woman from the one who'd given us our permit, looked at me with obvious concern. "Ma'am, are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" "No, you don't understand. We were camping, and something in the forest, something in the lake." "Ma'am, please calm down. Let's start from the beginning. What's your name?" "Jennifer Williams. My husband and I were backpacking the Weston Lake Loop, and something happened to him. He's not Michael anymore." The ranger was already reaching for her radio. "I'm going to call for a park medical team. You're clearly in shock." "No!" I grabbed her arm. "You have to listen to me. Check your records. Look up the local stories. The Gula people. They know about this place. They warned us." The ranger's expression shifted slightly. "What exactly did they tell you?" "That things that go into the swamps don't come out the same." For a long moment, the ranger just stared at me. Then she set down her radio and leaned forward. "Where exactly were you camping?" "Weston Lake. There was a platform right on the water." The ranger frowned. "Ma'am, there is no Weston Lake in Congaree National Park. The Weston Lake Trail is named after a historical location that was drained decades ago. It's just forest now." The blood drained from my face. "That's impossible. We camped right beside it. I saw Michael in the water." "Ma'am, I need you to think very carefully. Are you certain your husband came out of the forest with you?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I thought about Michael's confident navigation through the forest, his casual use of an endearment he'd never used before, the way he'd known exactly which trail to take without consulting the map. "No," I whispered. "No, I don't think he did." The ranger nodded grimly. "We've had reports before. People going missing in the deep forest, then showing up days later with no memory of where they'd been. Sometimes their families say they're different afterward." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe the old-timers know something we don't. Maybe there are things in that forest that are older and stranger than we want to admit." A shadow fell across the visitor center windows, and I turned to see Michael standing outside, pressing his face against the glass. His expression was no longer human. It was hungry, predatory, patient as a spider waiting for its prey to exhaust itself in the web. "That's him," I whispered. "That's the thing that took my husband." The ranger looked where I was pointing, then back at me with confusion. "Ma'am, I don't see anyone there." I spun to look at the window again, but it was empty. nothing but afternoon sunlight and the parking lot beyond. He was just there, I insisted, but doubt was creeping in. You have to believe me. The ranger was reaching for her radio again. I'm calling for medical assistance. You're clearly experiencing some kind of psychological episode. No, wait. But it was too late. Within minutes, EMTs were loading me into an ambulance despite my protests, asking me about head injuries and drug use and when I'd last eaten. They found Michael in the parking lot. Apparently, he'd been waiting by our car the entire time, worried sick about me. She's been under a lot of stress, I heard him tell the EMTs as they strapped me to a gurney. Working too hard, not sleeping enough. I think she had some kind of breakdown. He rode with me to the hospital, holding my hand and speaking in soothing tones about getting me the help I needed. To everyone else, he was the perfect, concerned husband. But when the medical staff weren't looking, his grip on my hand became painful, his thumb tracing circles on my skin in a pattern that felt deliberate and threatening. They kept me under observation for 72 hours. Michael visited every day, bringing flowers and magazines and speaking to the doctors about my recent stress levels and history of anxiety. He was charming and believable, and exactly the sort of devoted husband any medical professional would want to see. When they released me, he drove me home to our apartment in Charleston, chattering about taking some time off work and maybe seeing a counselor together. He made dinner and ran me a bath and tucked me into bed with gentle kisses. But he never blinked. Not once during those first few days home. I started sleeping with a knife under my pillow. It's been 3 months now, and I've learned to live with the thing that wears my husband's face. I smile when it touches me, laugh at its jokes, respond to its attempts at intimacy. I've become very good at pretending that everything is normal, but I'm planning. Late at night, when the creature sleeps its unnatural, motionless sleep, I research. I've found the old Gula stories the ranger mentioned, tales of spirits that inhabit the deep swamps and take the forms of those they've consumed. They call them boo-hags, malevolent entities that shed their skin at night and slip into the bodies of the living. The stories say there are ways to destroy them. Salt circles, iron nails, certain combinations of herbs and roots. Most importantly, they say that if you can destroy the creature's original skin, the form it inhabits during the day, you can trap its spirit and force it to reveal the location of its victims. Michael might still be alive. My real Michael, trapped somewhere in that impossible lake that exists between the spaces of the world. I'm going back to Congaree next weekend. I've told the creature that I want to face my fears, to reclaim the wilderness experience that traumatized me. It pretended to be concerned, but I could see the hunger in those black eyes it shows me when it thinks I'm not looking. It wants to take me back to that lake. It wants to finish what it started, but I'll be ready this time. I've prepared salt and iron, sage and sweetgrass blessed by a Gula root doctor who understood exactly what I was facing. I've memorized the words that will bind it, the rituals that will force it to show me its true form. One way or another, I'm going to find my husband, or die trying. The creature wearing Michael's face just came home from work. It's calling my name from the kitchen, asking about dinner, sounding perfectly normal and loving and human. I close my laptop and slip the knife out from under my pillow, tucking it into the waistband of my jeans. "Coming, sweetheart," I call back, practicing my smile in the mirror. Soon. My name is Sarah Rodriguez, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Francis Marion National Forest in South Carolina 3 weeks ago, and I still wake up screaming. I should have known something was wrong when my GPS started glitching the moment we crossed into the deeper woods. The blue dot that represented our location kept jumping around the screen like a trapped insect, placing us miles from where we actually stood. Mike laughed it off, said technology always failed him anyway. Jess just shrugged and pulled out her paper map, but when she unfolded it, the lines seemed to blur and shift before our eyes, the topographical markings becoming illegible smears of brown and green. "Must be the humidity," she said, but her voice carried an edge of uncertainty that made my stomach clench. We were supposed to be deep in the backcountry for 4 days, just the 3 of us and our packs, following an old trail that Mike's grandfather had shown him years ago. Mike Williams, tall, bearded, perpetually optimistic Mike who could start a fire in a rainstorm and navigate by the stars. Jessica Allen, Jess, my best friend since college, tough as nails but with a laugh that could light up a room. And me, Sarah, the anxious one, the one who packed 3 extra flashlights and enough first aid supplies for a small army. The trail wasn't on any official map. Mike's grandfather had been a logger back in the 50s, working sections of the forest that had been closed to the public for decades. "Trust me," Mike had said when we planned this trip. "It's like stepping back in time. No other hikers, no cell towers, just pure wilderness. Pure wilderness." The phrase should have been enticing, but as we walked deeper into the forest that first day, it felt more like a threat. The trees here were different, older somehow. Massive live oaks draped in Spanish moss that hung like funeral shrouds, their branches creating a canopy so thick that even at midday the forest floor remained in perpetual twilight. The air was thick and humid, pressing against our skin like a living thing. Every step we took seemed muffled, absorbed by the spongy earth and thick vegetation. "How much further to the campsite?" Jess asked around noon, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. Mike consulted his grandfather's hand-drawn map, a piece of paper so old and worn it looked like it might crumble at any moment. "Should be just another mile or so. There's a clearing near a creek, supposedly." But the creek, when we found it, wasn't running clear like Mike had promised. The water was dark, almost black, moving sluggishly between moss-covered banks. It smelled wrong, not just the earthy smell of a forest stream, but something else underneath, something sweet and rotting. "Maybe we should find somewhere else to camp," I suggested, but Mike was already dropping his pack. "Water's water," he said. "We can purify it. Besides, this is the spot. Look." He pointed to an old blaze mark on a nearby tree, a faded X carved deep into the bark. "Grandfather's mark?" The clearing wasn't much, maybe 30 feet across, surrounded by towering pines that creaked and groaned in the humid air despite the absence of any wind. We set up our tents in a rough triangle, mine and Jess's close together, Mike's about 10 feet away. As the sun began to set, earlier than it should have, according to my watch, we tried to start a campfire. That was when the second strange thing happened. No matter what we did, the fire wouldn't catch properly. The matches would light, the kindling would start to smolder, but then the flames would turn a strange blue color and sputter out. We tried different wood, different arrangements, even some of the fire starter cubes I'd brought as backup. Nothing worked. "This is weird," Jess muttered, striking yet another match. The flame danced blue for a moment, then died. Mike frowned, kneeling beside the fire ring. "Maybe the wood's too damp." But the wood felt dry in our hands, and the air, despite its humidity, didn't feel damp enough to prevent a fire from starting. There was something else at work here, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. As darkness fell, and it fell fast, like a curtain being drawn across the sky, we huddled around our pathetic bluish fire and ate cold sandwiches. The forest around us was alive with sounds, the rustle of leaves, the crack of branches, the distant hoot of an owl. Normal forest sounds, but somehow they felt amplified, more present than they should be. "Did you guys hear that?" Jess whispered suddenly. We all froze, listening. At first I heard nothing unusual, just the normal nighttime symphony of the woods. But then, carried on the still air, came a sound that made my blood run cold. Crying. The unmistakable sound of a child crying, somewhere out in the darkness beyond our circle of weak blue light. "That's—" Mike started, then stopped. "That's probably just an animal. Raccoons can sound like—" The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by something worse. Silence. Complete, unnatural silence. Even the insects had gone quiet. "We should check it out," Mike said, standing up. "No." The word came out of my mouth with more force than I'd intended. No, we should not check it out. We should stay right here by the fire. Jess looked at me with concern. Sarah, you okay? You look pale. I wasn't okay. Every instinct I had was screaming that something was wrong, that we needed to pack up our gear and hike out of here, darkness be damned. But I couldn't articulate why. It was just a feeling, a primal terror that seemed to emanate from the forest itself. I'm fine, I lied. Just tired. But sleep, when it finally came, brought no rest. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the nylon ceiling of my tent, listening to the sounds outside. The crying had started again sometime after midnight, but now it seemed to move, circling our campsite like a predator stalking its prey. Sometimes it sounded close, sometimes distant, but it never stopped completely. Around 3 a.m, I heard Mike's tent zipper open. "Mike?" I whispered, "you okay?" No answer. I heard footsteps moving away from the campsite, crunching through the underbrush. Then silence. I must have dozed, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was filtering through the trees and Jess was shaking my shoulder. "Sarah, wake up. Mike's gone." I sat up quickly, my heart immediately racing. "What do you mean, gone?" "His tent's empty. His sleeping bag's still warm, but he's not here." We searched the immediate area around our campsite, calling his name. His boots were gone, but everything else, his pack, his clothes, even his wallet, was still in his tent. It was as if he'd simply walked out into the forest in the middle of the night wearing nothing but what he'd slept in. "Maybe he went to find better water," Jess suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. "In the middle of the night? In his underwear?" We waited. We called his name until our voices were hoarse. We even tried following what looked like tracks leading away from the campsite, but they disappeared after about 50 yards, as if Mike had simply vanished into thin air. "We should hike out," I said as the sun reached its zenith. "Get help." "He might come back," Jess protested, "if we leave and he comes back." But I was already packing my gear. Every minute we stayed in this place felt like a minute closer to disaster. The forest felt wrong, not just quiet but actively hostile, as if it resented our presence. We were just shouldering our packs when we heard him. "Hey guys, sorry about that." Mike emerged from the tree line, grinning widely, looking completely normal except for the fact that he was still in his underwear and his bare feet were somehow perfectly clean despite having supposedly walked through the forest floor. "Mike!" Jess dropped her pack and ran to him. "Where the hell have you been? We've been worried sick." "Just went for a walk," he said, and that grin never wavered. "Lost track of time." "For 12 hours?" I demanded. "In your underwear?" Mike looked down at himself as if just noticing his state of undress. "Oh, right, must have been sleepwalking. I do that sometimes." He laughed, but it sounded wrong somehow. Too high, too forced. "You've never sleepwalked in the 10 years I've known you," I said. "People change." Mike's grin widened impossibly, showing too many teeth. "Besides, I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. I feel great." Jess seemed satisfied with this explanation, but I wasn't. Something was fundamentally wrong with Mike, though I couldn't put my finger on what. It wasn't just the sleepwalking story or the clean feet, or even the constant grinning. It was something in his eyes. They seemed flat, reflective, like the eyes of a doll. "Let's pack up and head home," I said. "This trip's been weird enough." "Actually," Mike said, pulling on his clothes, "I was thinking we should stay another night. I found this amazing spot deeper in the woods. Really beautiful." "No," I said firmly. "We're leaving." For just a moment, Mike's grin faltered and I saw something else in his expression. Something cold and predatory. But then the smile was back, bright and artificial. "Sure, Sarah, whatever you think is best." But as we broke camp, I noticed things. Little things that added up to a growing sense of dread. Mike wasn't sweating, despite the humid heat that had the rest of us drenched within minutes. His footsteps made no sound as we hiked, even though Jess and I were crunching through the undergrowth with every step. and he kept looking back over his shoulder, not at the trail behind us, but at us, at Jess and me, with that same unnatural grin. We'd been hiking for about 2 hours when Jess stopped suddenly. "Guys," she said, her voice tight with confusion, "aren't we going in a circle?" I looked around. She was right. We were standing next to the same massive oak tree we'd passed an hour ago, the one with the distinctive scar across its trunk. But according to Mike, we'd been following the trail out of the forest. "The trail curves," Mike said, still grinning. "It's hard to tell direction in these woods." But I pulled out my compass and it was spinning wildly, unable to find magnetic north. The sun, which should have been to our west in the afternoon, seemed to be directly overhead, creating no shadows. "Mike," I said slowly, "where exactly are you leading us?" "Out," he said simply. "Just like you wanted." But we hiked for 3 more hours and never seemed to get any closer to the forest edge. The trees grew thicker, the canopy darker, the air more oppressive. My watch had stopped working, the hands frozen at 3:17, though I couldn't remember what time it had been when I'd last looked. "I need to rest," Jess said finally, slumping against a tree. "This is insane. We should have reached the parking area hours ago." I knelt beside her, offering my water bottle. "Are you okay?" "Just tired. And this heat." She looked pale, almost gray. Mike stood about 10 feet away, watching us with that perpetual smile. He hadn't taken a single sip of water or shown any sign of fatigue. In fact, he looked better than when we started. His skin had a healthy glow. His eyes were bright and alert. "You know what?" I said, making a decision. "We're setting up camp here for the night. In the morning, we'll figure out where we are." "Good idea," Mike said. "I'll gather firewood." He disappeared into the trees and I immediately grabbed Jess's arm. "Something's wrong with Mike," I whispered urgently. "What do you mean?" "Haven't you noticed? He's not acting like himself. The grinning, the way he's not getting tired or thirsty, the fact that he's leading us in circles." Jess looked confused. "Sarah, you're scaring me. Mike's fine. Maybe a little more upbeat than usual, but when's the last time you saw him blink?" The question hung in the air between us. Jess opened her mouth to answer, then closed it, frowning. I don't know. Why would I notice something like that?" "Because people blink, Jess. It's automatic. But Mike hasn't blinked once since he came back this morning." We were interrupted by the sound of Mike returning, dragging a large dead branch behind him. As he approached our impromptu campsite, I watched his face carefully. The grin was there, constant and unwavering. His eyes were fixed on us with uncomfortable intensity. And Jess was right. I couldn't remember seeing him blink. Not once. "Found some good wood," he announced cheerfully. "This'll burn nice and hot." But when we tried to light the fire, the same thing happened as the night before. The flames turned blue and sputtered out, refusing to catch properly. Mike seemed unconcerned by this, but I saw Jess growing more agitated. "This is impossible," she muttered, striking another match. "Wood burns. It's supposed to burn." "Maybe it's cursed," Mike said, and laughed. The sound echoed strangely in the forest as if it were coming from multiple directions at once. As darkness fell, again too early, we huddled around our pathetic excuse for a fire and ate more cold food. The forest around us was alive with sounds again. The rustle of leaves, the crack of branches, the distant crying of that child we'd heard the night before. But tonight, the crying was closer, and it was definitely the sound of a child. A young girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old, sobbing as if her heart were breaking. "We have to help her," Jess said, starting to stand. "No." Mike's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. "You don't want to go out there." Something in his tone made both Jess and me freeze. For just a moment his grin had disappeared, replaced by an expression of such malevolent intensity that I felt my bladder threaten to let go. "Let go of me," Jess said quietly. Mike's grin snapped back into place. "Sorry, just worried about you wandering off in the dark. These woods can be dangerous." The crying continued throughout the night, sometimes close, sometimes far away. But there were other sounds, too. Whispers that seemed to come from the trees themselves, speaking words I couldn't quite make out. The rustle of something large moving through the underbrush, and underneath it all, a low humming that seemed to vibrate in my bones. I didn't sleep. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of my tent, listening to the sounds outside and trying to make sense of what was happening. Every rational part of my mind insisted that there had to be a logical explanation for everything. The GPS malfunction, the compass spinning, Mike's strange behavior. But rational thought was becoming harder and harder to maintain. Something was very wrong in these woods, something that had taken Mike, or replaced him, or changed him into something that only looked like my friend. Around dawn, I heard Jess scream. I was out of my tent in seconds, stumbling in the gray pre-dawn light. Jess was standing outside her tent, staring at something on the ground. When I followed her gaze, my stomach dropped. Her sleeping bag was spread out on the forest floor, about 20 feet from her tent. The zipper was open from the inside, as if someone had crawled out of it and left it there. "I woke up outside," she whispered. "I was sleeping outside my tent, in my sleeping bag, but I went to sleep inside the tent. I remember zipping myself in." Mike emerged from his tent, grinning as always. "Sleepwalking," he said cheerfully. "It's contagious." But there was something else. Jess's sleeping bag was covered in a thin layer of what looked like frost, despite the humid warmth of the morning. And there were marks in the soft earth around it. Not footprints exactly, but long, dragging gouges, as if something had pulled the sleeping bag out of the tent. "We're leaving," I announced. "Right now. We're hiking out of here, and we're not stopping until we reach the car." "I agree," Jess said quickly. She looked as scared as I felt. Mike's grin wavered slightly. "But we just got here. I haven't had a chance to show you the really special places yet." "I don't care," I said, stuffing my gear into my pack with shaking hands. "This place is wrong, Mike. Can't you feel it?" "I feel wonderful," he said, and his smile stretched even wider. "Better than I have in years. These woods, they're healing. They're perfect." Something in his tone made me look up. Mike was standing perfectly still, arms at his sides, that impossible grin stretching across his face. But his eyes were completely black. Not the pupils, but the entire eye, including what should have been the whites. "Jesus Christ," Jess breathed. Mike tilted his head to one side like a curious dog. "What's wrong? Don't you like my eyes? I think they're beautiful now. They see so much more than they used to." I grabbed Jess's hand. "Run!" We ran, crashed through the undergrowth, branches tearing at our clothes, roots trying to trip us with every step. Behind us I could hear Mike laughing, that same echoing laugh that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You can't leave," he called after us. "The woods won't let you. You belong here now." We ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out. Then we walked as fast as we could manage. The forest seemed to shift around us, trails appearing and disappearing, the canopy growing thicker overhead until we were moving through green twilight even though it should have been full daylight. "Sarah," Jess panted, grabbing my arm. "Look." We were back at the dark creek. The same twisted trees, the same black water, the same smell of decay. We'd been hiking for hours, but somehow we'd ended up exactly where we'd started. "This is impossible," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew that impossible had stopped meaning anything in this place. Mike stepped out from behind one of the massive oaks, still grinning, still perfectly clean despite our hours of desperate hiking. "I told you," he said. "The woods won't let you leave. Not anymore." "What do you want?" I demanded. "Want?" Mike laughed. "I don't want anything, but they do." He gestured vaguely at the trees around us. "They've been alone for so long, hungry for so long. They need company." "What happened to the real Mike?" Jess asked quietly. The thing wearing Mike's face considered this. "He's still here. Part of him, anyway. Down deep, where it's dark and quiet. He doesn't mind sharing anymore. It was getting dark again, though it couldn't have been more than noon. The shadows between the trees were deepening, becoming solid, reaching toward us with fingers of pure darkness. "Run," I whispered to Jess. "There's nowhere to run to," the mic thing said. "This is home now. You'll understand soon. When they come for you tonight, when they crawl inside your dreams and make them real, you'll understand how wonderful it is to stop fighting." But we ran anyway, deeper into the woods, further from any hope of escape, but we ran because the alternative was standing there and letting whatever had taken Mike take us too. The forest was changing around us as we ran. The trees were growing taller, their branches intertwining overhead to form a living ceiling that blocked out all but the faintest traces of light. The ground beneath our feet was becoming softer, spongier, covered with a thick layer of moss that seemed to glow with its own pale light. And the sounds. God, the sounds. The crying child had been joined by other voices. Men screaming, women sobbing, children laughing with mad glee. They seemed to come from the trees themselves, as if the forest were singing a song of madness and despair. "Sarah?" Jess grabbed my arm, pulling me to a stop. I followed her gaze and felt what little sanity I had left begin to crumble. There were people in the trees, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, hanging from the branches like fruit. Some were obviously dead, their bodies withered and mummified by time and weather. But others were moving, turning their heads to watch us pass, reaching out with skeletal hands as if begging for help. "Please," one of them whispered as we passed beneath her tree. She was a young woman, maybe in her 20s, her clothes rotted away to reveal gray, desiccated skin. "Please don't leave us here. Don't let them take you too." "How long have you been here?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Time doesn't work here," she said. "Could be days, could be decades. They feed on us slowly, keep us alive to savor our fear." More voices joined hers, a chorus of the trapped and the dying. "Turn back. Don't trust him. He's not your friend anymore. The forest is hungry." But there was nowhere to turn back to. We were lost in a nightmare, and the only way was forward, deeper into whatever hell this place had become. The mic thing was waiting for us in the next clearing, sitting casually on a fallen log as if he'd been there for hours. "You're tired," he observed. "You should rest, sleep, dream beautiful dreams." "Stay away from us," Jess warned, but her voice was weak with exhaustion. "I don't need to come closer," Mike said. "Look around you." The trees ringing the clearing were full of people. Men, women, children, all hanging like grotesque Christmas ornaments from the branches. Some were clearly long dead, but others were moving, writhing, trying to speak through mouths that no longer worked properly. "They used to fight too," Mike said conversationally. "Used to run and scream and try to escape. But the forest is patient. It has all the time in the world." "What is this place?" I demanded. "Sacred ground," Mike replied. The Cherokee knew about it, called it the Hungry Earth. White settlers learned too eventually. That's why it was closed to the public, why it doesn't appear on any maps. Some places are too dangerous for ordinary people to visit. "Then why did you bring us here?" Mike's grin widened until it seemed to split his face in half. "I didn't. Grandfather's map was just a way to get you started. The forest called you here. It's been calling you for years, Sarah. Haven't you felt it? The dreams about dark trees and black water? The feeling that something was watching you from the shadows?" I had felt it. The dreams, the sense of being watched, the inexplicable dread that sometimes overwhelmed me for no reason. I'd attributed it to anxiety, to stress, but now I realized it had been something else entirely. "You're lying," I said, but the words felt hollow. "The forest doesn't lie. It just is, and now you're part of it, whether you want to be or not." As if responding to his words, the trees around us began to move. Not swaying in the wind, there was no wind, but actively reaching toward us with branch fingers that stretched and twisted like living things. The people hanging from those branches screamed as they were jostled, their voices creating a symphony of agony that made my ears ring. "It's starting," Mike said happily. "They're coming for you now." The trees were definitely closer than they had been a moment before. The clearing was shrinking, the branches reaching down toward us with hungry intent. Some of the hanging people were being lowered, their feet just inches from the ground, their dead eyes fixed on us with desperate longing. "Jess," I said urgently, "my pack, the flare gun." She understood immediately. While I kept my eyes on the approaching trees, she rummaged through my pack until she found the emergency flare gun I'd insisted on bringing. It was designed for signaling rescue aircraft, but right now it was the only weapon we had. "Will it work?" she whispered. "Only one way to find out." I aimed the flare gun at the nearest tree and pulled the trigger. The flare shot out in a brilliant red arc, striking the trunk and exploding in a shower of sparks and flame. The tree recoiled as if it had been struck by lightning, its branches whipping back with a sound like screaming wind. The people hanging from that tree screamed too, but not in pain, in joy. "Burn it," the young woman called out. "Burn it all." But even as the first tree caught fire, the others were pressing closer. We had maybe 30 seconds before they reached us, and I only had 3 more flares. "The creek," I said suddenly. "The water. It flows out of the forest. If we can follow it—" We ran toward the sound of running water, crashing through undergrowth that seemed to grab at our ankles with every step. Behind us, the forest was burning, the flames spreading from tree to tree with unnatural speed. But instead of the usual orange and yellow, these flames burned black and purple, creating more darkness than light. The creek was exactly where I remembered it, its dark water flowing sluggishly between moss-covered banks. Without hesitation, I plunged into the water, gasping as the cold shocked my system. Jess followed, and together we began wading downstream, fighting against the current and the sucking mud at the bottom. The water was deeper than it looked, reaching our waists within a few yards. But worse than the depth was what we could feel moving beneath the surface. Things that brushed against our legs with rubbery persistence. Things that felt like hands reaching up from the bottom to pull us down. "Don't look down," I warned Jess. "Whatever you do, don't look down." But she looked anyway and screamed. The creek bottom was lined with bodies. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, preserved in the dark water like specimens in formaldehyde. Their eyes were open, staring up at us, and their mouths moved silently as if they were trying to speak. "Keep moving," I said, though my own voice was shaking. "Just keep moving." We waded through that nightmare stream for what felt like hours, stepping on the submerged dead, feeling their hands clutch at our ankles with every step. The forest on either side was still burning, the black flames casting dancing shadows on the water. Behind us, I could hear Mike calling our names, his voice echoing strangely off the water. But he sounded different now, less human, more like the voice of the forest itself. "Sarah, Jess, come back. You can't escape this way. The creek doesn't lead out. It leads deeper." I prayed he was lying, but as we continued downstream, the water grew deeper and the current stronger. We were being pulled along now whether we wanted to be or not, carried by the dark water toward whatever lay ahead. The creek widened into a pool, then a pond, then what could only be described as a lake. The water was perfectly black and perfectly still, reflecting the burning forest like a mirror. In the center of the lake was a small island, and on that island was a structure that made my blood freeze in my veins. It was a church, an old wooden church with a tall steeple and broken windows, but it was wrong in every way. Leaning at an impossible angle, its walls bulging outward as if something inside was trying to get out, its steeple twisted into a spiral that hurt to look at. "We have to swim to it," I said, though every instinct I had was screaming against the idea. "Are you insane?" Jess gasped. "It's the only dry land, and look, there's a boat on the other side." She was right. Pulled up on the far shore of the island was a small rowboat. If we could reach it, if it was still seaworthy, Maybe we could escape this nightmare. We swam across that black lake with the desperate stroke of the drowning. The water was warm, almost hot, and it felt thick against our skin, like swimming through blood. Things moved beneath us, large things that bumped against our legs and torsos as we swam. The island, when we finally dragged ourselves onto its muddy shore, felt solid under our feet. But the church was clearly wrong in ways that went beyond the physical. It was singing. Not human voices, but the building itself was producing a low, harmonious sound that seemed to come from the very boards and nails. The broken windows glowed with a faint, sickly light, and shadows moved inside, shadows that were too large and too angular to be human. "We don't go in there," I said firmly. "We get the boat, and we get out of here." But as we approached the boat, I realized our escape wasn't going to be as simple as I'd hoped. The boat was there, yes, but it was ancient, little more than rotting wood held together by rusted nails. Worse, it was occupied. A skeleton sat in the stern, still wearing the tattered remains of what might once have been a park ranger's uniform. In its bony hands was a logbook, and scattered around its feet were more bones. The bones of children. Jess bent over and retched, but I forced myself to look at the logbook. The last entry was dated 15 years ago. Day 47. The children stopped crying yesterday. I think they're finally at peace. The church is calling to me now, singing my name. I think I'll go inside. I think I'll stay forever. The signature was illegible, but pinned to the skeleton's shirt was a name tag. Ranger M. Patterson. 47 days, I whispered. He was trapped here for 47 days. From across the water came the sound of Mike calling our names again, but his voice was different now, deeper, more resonant, as if it were coming from the throat of something much larger than a human being. "The boat won't work," Jess said, and she was right. The hull was so rotted that we could see through it in several places. It would sink the moment we put it in the water. "Then we wait," I said. "Find shelter, wait for daylight, figure out another way." But even as I said it, I realized that daylight might never come to this place. The sky above us was black despite what should have been afternoon, and the only illumination came from the burning forest and the sickly glow from the church windows. We were trapped on an island in a lake of the dead, with no way off and nowhere to go. That was when the church door opened. It swung outward with a long, rusty creak, and the glow from inside grew brighter. The singing got louder, too, becoming almost beautiful in its alien harmony. And in the doorway, silhouetted against the light, was a figure. It was tall and thin, wearing what might once have been a priest's cassock. But as it stepped out of the church and into the open, I could see that it wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its fingers extended into sharp points, and its face was a smooth blank, like unfinished clay. "Welcome," it said, and its voice was the sound of wind through dead leaves. "We've been expecting you." Behind it came others, dozens of them, all wearing the tattered remnants of different clothing from different eras. A woman in a Victorian dress with a hole where her face should be. A man in a World War II uniform whose chest cavity was empty and hollow. Children in clothing from the 1950s, their eyes replaced by writhing shadows. "The congregation," the priest thing said. "They're so excited to meet you. It's been so long since we've had new members." They began to move toward us, not walking but gliding across the muddy ground. Their movements were perfectly synchronized, like a dance they'd performed 1,000 times before. "Stay back!" I shouted, raising the flare gun. The priest thing tilted its smooth head. "That won't help you here. This is sacred ground, holy ground. Your weapons have no power here." But I fired anyway. The flare struck the priest thing's center mass and exploded in a shower of sparks. For a moment it staggered, its form wavering like heat shimmer. But then it solidified again, and I could see the hole the flare had torn in its chest closing like water. "Aggressive," it observed mildly. "I like that. You'll make a fine addition to our family." The congregation was almost upon us now. I grabbed Jess's hand and pulled her toward the water. "We swim," I said. "We swim, and we don't stop until we reach the other shore." We plunged back into the Black Lake just as the first of the congregation reached the spot where we'd been standing. Behind us, I could hear the priest thing calling out in a language I didn't recognize, its voice carrying clearly across the water. Swimming back across that lake was a special kind of hell. The things beneath the surface were more active now, more aggressive. Something with too many teeth grabbed my ankle and nearly pulled me under before Jess managed to kick it away. A hand reached up from the depths and grabbed a handful of my hair, yanking hard enough to bring tears to my eyes. But we made it to the far shore, collapsing on the muddy bank with our lungs burning and our muscles screaming. Behind us, the congregation stood at the edge of the island, watching but not pursuing. They couldn't cross the water, I realized. The lake was a barrier that even they couldn't breach. But the victory was short-lived. As we lay gasping on the shore, I heard familiar footsteps approaching through the burning trees. Mike stepped out of the inferno, grinning as always, his clothes somehow unsinged by the flames that raged behind him. "Did you have fun?" he asked conversationally. "I hope you enjoyed the tour. Most people don't get to see so much of the forest on their first visit." "What do you want from us?" I demanded, struggling to my feet. "I told you, the forest is hungry. It needs to feed." Mike's grin widened, showing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous. "But it's not just about the feeding. It's about the joining, the becoming." As he spoke, I could see changes in his appearance that I'd missed before. His skin had a grayish pallor, and dark veins were visible beneath the surface, spreading across his face like cracks in marble. His eyes, still completely black, seemed to be sinking deeper into his skull. "You're dying," I said. "Dying?" Mike laughed. "I'm transforming, becoming something better, something more. The forest offers immortality, Sarah. Not life as we know it, but existence beyond death, beyond pain, beyond fear. At what cost? Everything." His grin never wavered. Everything human, everything weak, everything that holds us back from our true potential. The congregation on the island had begun to sing again, their voices carrying across the water in harmonies that human throats couldn't produce. The sound was hypnotic, almost beautiful, and I found myself taking a step toward the water before Jess grabbed my arm. "Don't listen," she warned. "It's trying to call you back." But it wasn't just the congregation singing now. The forest itself had joined in, the trees adding their voices to the chorus. The sound surrounded us, filled us, made our bones vibrate with its alien melody. "You can't resist forever," Mike said. "The song will call you home eventually. It called me, just like it called everyone else who ever set foot in these woods. You can fight it, but you'll lose. You'll always lose." I still had 2 flares left. I aimed the gun at Mike and fired. The flare struck him in the chest and exploded, but instead of falling or crying out in pain, he just looked down at the burning hole in his shirt with mild interest. "That tickles," he said. The wound was already healing, the flesh knitting itself back together with sickening speed. Within seconds, there was no sign that he'd been injured at all. "You can't kill something that's already dead," he explained helpfully, "and you can't escape something that exists everywhere at once." As if to prove his point, more figures began emerging from the burning trees. Men and women in clothing from different eras, all wearing the same serene expression, all moving with the same synchronized grace. They formed a circle around us, closing off any hope of escape. "The forest has been collecting for a long time," Mike said. "Hikers, campers, hunters, even the occasional park ranger, anyone who wandered too far from the beaten path. We're all here, all part of the family now." "How many?" Jess whispered. "Hundreds, maybe thousands. The forest has been hungry for so very long." The circle was tightening now, the collected dead moving closer with each step. Their faces were all wrong, too pale, too still, with eyes that reflected light like a cat's in the darkness. "Don't be afraid," Mike said gently. "It doesn't hurt." Not really. There's a moment of disconnection, and then you're part of something larger, something eternal. I had one flare left, one chance to create enough of a distraction to make a run for it. But where could we run to? We were surrounded by forest on all sides, and the forest was alive, hungry, hostile. "Sarah," Jess whispered urgently. "The church. Look at the church." I glanced across the lake. The twisted structure on the island was glowing brighter now, its windows blazing with that sickly light. But there was something else. Movement in the steeple. Something large and dark shifting against the illumination. "What is it?" I asked. I think it's the source. The thing that controls the forest." She was right. As I watched, the movement in the steeple resolved into a shape. Something with too many arms and too many eyes. Something that pulsed with its own malevolent life. It was the heart of the forest. The thing that had been calling to people for decades, luring them into its domain to feed its endless hunger. "If we could destroy it," I began. "With what? You've got one flare left, and you saw what good they do against these things." But even as she spoke, I was forming a plan. A desperate, probably suicidal plan, but the only one I could think of. "The gas," I said suddenly. "Your camp stove. How much fuel is left?" Jess checked her pack. "Most of a canister. Why?" "Because fire is the only thing they seem to react to. And if that thing in the church is controlling everything else—" Understanding dawned in her eyes. "You want to swim back to the island, with a bomb." "It's not a bomb. It's just a gas canister and a flare. But if I can get close enough to that thing in the steeple—" "That's suicide, Sarah." "Maybe, but if I don't try, we're dead anyway. Look around you." The circle of the dead had tightened until they were only a few feet away. Their faces were expectant, almost eager, as if they were looking forward to welcoming us into their ranks. "I'll distract them," Jess said suddenly. "Draw them away from the water. Give you time to swim across." "No, it's too dangerous." "More dangerous than what you're planning?" She squeezed my hand. "If you're going to do this, do it now, before I lose my nerve." I looked into her eyes and saw the same desperate determination I felt. We were going to die in this place. That much was certain. But maybe, just maybe, we could take the thing controlling it with us. "On 3, I said. 1. I pulled the gas canister from Jess's pack and twisted off the cap, letting the fuel pour out over my clothes. 2. Jess suddenly shrieked at the top of her lungs and ran directly at the nearest member of the congregation, a woman in a 1940s dress whose face was a mass of writhing shadows. 3. I ran for the water. The congregation, startled by Jess's sudden charge, turned to pursue her. I heard Mike shouting something behind me, but I was already in the lake, swimming as hard as I could toward the island. The gas fumes from my soaked clothes made my eyes water and my lungs burn, but I kept swimming. Things grabbed at me from below, more aggressively than before. Teeth sank into my leg, hands clutched at my arms, faces pressed up from the depths with mouths open in silent screams. But I fought them off, kicking and thrashing my way across that black water fueled by desperation and the knowledge that this was our only chance. The congregation on the island was waiting for me, standing in perfect formation along the shore, but they didn't try to stop me as I hauled myself out of the water. Instead, they parted like a curtain, creating a clear path to the church. "Welcome," the priest thing said. "We've been waiting so long for you to come home." I walked toward the church, dripping lake water and gasoline, the flare gun clutched in my shaking hand. With each step, the singing grew louder, more insistent, more beautiful. It was calling to something deep inside me, something that wanted to stop fighting and surrender to the eternal peace of the dead. The church door stood open, and beyond it, I could see a spiral staircase leading up to the steeple. At the top of those stairs, something vast and terrible was waiting, its many eyes reflecting the light like stars. I climbed the stairs, each step bringing me closer to the thing that had destroyed so many lives, claimed so many souls. The singing was deafening now, a chorus of the damned that made my ears bleed and my vision blur. At the top of the stairs was a chamber, and in that chamber was something that defied description. It was plant and animal and something else entirely, a fusion of flesh and wood and shadow that pulsed with its own sick life. Hundreds of eyes covered its surface, all turning to focus on me as I entered its domain. Tendrils of woody flesh reached out from its central mass, and at the end of each tendril was a human face, mouth open in eternal song. This was the heart of the forest, the source of its hunger, its malevolence, its power over the dead. Sarah, it said, and its voice was composed of every victim it had ever claimed. You've come so far, fought so hard, but the journey ends here. Yes, I agreed, raising the flare gun. It does. I pulled the trigger. The flare struck the creature center mass and exploded, igniting the gasoline that soaked my clothes. I became a pillar of fire in that twisted chamber, and the creature's scream shook the entire island. Its tendrils whipped frantically as the flames spread from me to its woody flesh, and one by one, the faces at the end of those tendrils fell silent. I was burning alive, but I was also burning it alive, and that was all that mattered. The last thing I remember was the sound of the creature's death cry, a wail of agony and loss that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then the flames consumed everything, and the world went black. I woke up in a hospital bed 3 days later. The doctors said hunters had found me unconscious at the edge of Francis Marion National Forest, suffering from severe dehydration and second-degree burns. There was no sign of Jess or Mike, no evidence that anyone else had been with me. The official report listed them as missing hikers, probably lost in the wilderness. I tried to tell them about the island, the church, the thing in the steeple. They nodded sympathetically and prescribed anti-anxiety medication. Trauma-induced hallucinations, they said, very common in cases of extreme stress and dehydration. But I know what I saw. I know what I destroyed. And I know that somewhere in those woods, Jessica Allen is still walking among the trees, grinning with too many teeth, her eyes reflecting light like a predator's in the darkness. Because the creature in the church wasn't the only thing controlling the forest. It was just the biggest one, the oldest one, the hungriest one. There are others, and now that I've taken away their leader, they're going to be looking for a replacement. They're going to be looking for me. Every night I hear them singing. Every night I dream of black water and twisted trees. And every morning I check the locks on my doors and windows, knowing that they won't be enough. The forest is patient. It has all the time in the world. And sooner or later, I'm going to answer its call. Sooner or later, we all do. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the Francis Marion National Forest in South Carolina, 3 miles past Hellhole Swamp, where the old logging roads disappear into cypress shadows and Spanish moss hangs like funeral shrouds. I should have known something was wrong when my GPS started glitching the moment we crossed the Santee River. The screen flickered between our location and empty static, showing us simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. But Sarah laughed it off, said technology always failed her in the woods, and Megan was already pulling out her grandfather's hand-drawn trail map from 1987, the one that had led us to some of our best camping spots over the years. We'd been doing these annual trips since college, just the 3 of us. Sarah Chen, my roommate from freshman year, now a pediatric nurse who could stitch up a wound with dental floss and calm a screaming child with a whispered joke. Megan Rodriguez, the adventure photographer who taught us both how to read the land, how to move quietly through the forest, how to respect the places where civilization hadn't yet planted its flags. They were my closest friends, the sisters I'd chosen, and I trusted them with my life. I wish I hadn't. The plan was simple. 3 days, 2 nights, deep in the forest where the tour groups never ventured. We'd hike to Widow's Hollow, an old depression in the land where a logging camp had operated in the 1920s before something made them abandon it overnight. Local folklore said the trees there grew too close together, that the canopy blocked out the sun even at noon, that sounds carried wrong in the still air. Perfect for Halloween weekend, Sarah had joked. We started our hike at dawn, when the October air was crisp and the light filtered golden through the pine needles. The trail began well-maintained, marked with the familiar white blazes that guided day hikers through the first few miles. But as we moved deeper, the blazes grew faint, then sporadic, then vanished entirely. "This is where it gets interesting," Megan said, consulting her grandfather's map. She traced a finger along a thin line that seemed to wander through areas marked only with cryptic symbols. A triangle here, a circle with a cross through it there. Papa always said these old maps showed more than just geography. The forest changed around us. The longleaf pines gave way to older growth, cypress and tupelo, their branches forming a canopy so thick that by early afternoon we were walking in perpetual twilight. Spanish moss draped everything like cobwebs, and the air grew thick with the smell of decomposition and stagnant water. "God, it's getting dark early," Sarah muttered, checking her watch. "It's only 3 o'clock." But when I looked at my own watch, the hands pointed to 6:17, then 4:32, then stopped altogether. "Magnetic interference," Megan said, but her voice carried less certainty than her words. "Lots of iron deposits in this area." We pressed on, following game trails and the occasional blaze that might have been a hiker's mark or might have been claw marks in the bark. The silence was absolute, except for our footsteps squelching in the boggy soil and the distant sound of water dripping from somewhere we couldn't see. That's when we heard the first sound. A child crying, soft and mournful, echoing through the trees from what seemed like every direction at once. We froze, listening, trying to pinpoint its source. "Hello?" Sarah called out. "Is someone there? Are you hurt?" The crying stopped immediately, cut off as if someone had closed a door. "Probably an animal," I said, but my voice sounded thin in the oppressive air. "Foxes can sound like—" The crying started again, closer now and definitely human. A little girl, sobbing like her heart was breaking, the sound floating toward us through the moss-draped trees. "We have to help," Sarah said, already dropping her pack and pulling out her first aid kit. "Wait." Megan grabbed her arm. "My grandfather told me about this place, about sounds that aren't what they seem." She lowered her voice to barely above a whisper. "He said, never follow the crying children into the hollow." "That's just folklore," Sarah snapped, but I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. There could be a real child lost out here. We argued in hushed tones while the crying continued, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, never quite coming from a direction we could agree on. Finally, we compromised. We'd continue to our planned campsite and set up for the night. If we still heard the crying in the morning, we'd investigate. Widow's Hollow opened before us just as the last traces of daylight faded from the canopy above. It was exactly as described, a circular depression in the land, perhaps 50 yards across, ringed by trees that grew so close together their trunks formed an almost solid wall. The ground was carpeted with pine needles and fallen leaves, dry and oddly bare of the undergrowth that choked the forest around us. "Perfect," Megan said, but something in her voice suggested she thought it was anything but. We set up camp in the center of the hollow, our 3 tents forming a triangle around where our fire pit would be. But when Sarah tried to light the kindling, the flames kept guttering out as if something was stealing the oxygen from the air. "Let me try," I said, kneeling beside the carefully arranged tinder. The match caught, the kindling began to smoke, and then the flames burned blue. Not the blue-white of a gas flame, but a deep, unnatural blue like the heart of a bruise. They gave off no heat and cast shadows that seemed to move independently of our movements. "What the hell?" Megan breathed. We stared at the impossible fire for a long moment before Sarah suddenly kicked dirt over it, plunging us into absolute darkness. "We'll eat cold food tonight," she said, her voice steady but tight. MREs don't need cooking anyway. We used our headlamps to finish setting up camp, the narrow beams of light seeming to be swallowed by the darkness just a few feet from their source. The silence was complete now. No insects, no rustling leaves, no distant night sounds. Just our breathing and the soft whisper of our movements. "I'm turning in early," Megan announced after we'd choked down our cold meals. "Long day tomorrow." Sarah and I agreed, though I suspected none of us would sleep well. As I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, I could hear my friends settling into their own tents. Sarah's breathing grew deep and regular within minutes. She'd always been able to sleep anywhere. But from Megan's tent came only silence. I lay awake for what felt like hours, listening to nothing. The darkness inside my tent was so complete I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. Even with my eyes adjusted, there was simply no light to gather. It pressed against me like a weight, making each breath feel deliberate and labored. Sometime deep in the night, I woke to the sound of my tent zipper opening. Not from the inside. I held perfectly still, pretending to sleep, as something moved outside my tent. Footsteps, but wrong, somehow. Too soft, with a strange sliding quality that made my skin crawl. They circled my tent once, twice, then stopped directly beside my head. I could hear breathing that wasn't quite human. Too slow, too deep, with a wet quality that suggested damaged lungs or something mimicking breathing without understanding how it should sound. "Jennifer," the voice whispered, and my blood turned to ice. It was Megan's voice, but flat, emotionless, like someone playing a recording of her speaking my name. "Jennifer, I need help. I'm lost." I squeezed my eyes shut and forced my breathing to remain slow and regular. The voice came again, closer to my ear, as if someone were kneeling beside my tent. "Jennifer, please, I can't find my way back." But Megan's tent was only 20 feet away. I'd seen her go into it. I'd heard her zip it closed. The breathing continued for several more minutes before the footsteps moved away, circling Sarah's tent with the same deliberate slowness. Then silence returned, so complete it felt like being buried alive. I didn't sleep again that night. When gray light finally filtered through the canopy, I emerged from my tent to find Sarah already up, staring at something in the dirt beside our dead fire pit. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a set of footprints in the soft earth. They were human-shaped but wrong, too long, with deep impressions where claws might have extended from the toes. They circled all three of our tents, sometimes overlapping our own tracks, sometimes veering off into the forest only to return and circle again. "Where's Megan?" I asked, noticing her tent was still zipped shut. Sarah shrugged. "Still sleeping, I guess. She's always been the last one up." But when we called her name, there was no response. When we unzipped her tent, we found it empty except for her sleeping bag, which had been opened from the inside and lay in a twisted heap. "Maybe she went to find water," Sarah suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. We searched the hollow, calling Megan's name, but the sound seemed to die just a few feet from our lips, swallowed by the oppressive air. Her pack was still in her tent, her boots still beside the entrance. If she'd left during the night, she'd done so barefoot and without supplies. "We need to get help," I said. "Something's wrong here." But when we tried to retrace our steps from the day before, the forest had changed. The game trails we'd followed were gone, replaced by walls of thorny undergrowth that seemed to grow denser with each step we took. Our own footprints from the previous day had vanished, as if the forest floor had been swept clean. "The map," Sarah said, pulling out Megan's grandfather's chart, but the paper was blank now. The careful ink lines and cryptic symbols faded to nothing, leaving only yellowed parchment that crumbled at the edges. We were lost. For hours we wandered, trying to find any landmark, any sign of the trail that had brought us here. But the forest seemed to shift around us, paths appearing and vanishing, clearings opening where none had been before. The canopy above grew thicker, blocking out more and more light until we moved through a green-tinged twilight even though my broken watch still pointed to what should have been noon. There, Sarah gasped, pointing through the trees. "I see someone." A figure moved between the cypress trunks, pale and distant. As we got closer, my heart leaped with recognition. "Megan!" She turned toward us, and I saw her face clearly for the first time. It was Megan, unmistakably, but something was wrong with her expression. Her smile was too wide, stretching her lips thin. Her eyes didn't blink, staring at us with an intensity that made my stomach clench. "I found the way out," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "Follow me." Sarah started toward her immediately, relief evident in every line of her body. But I hung back, remembering the voice from the night before, the footprints around our tents. "Megan," I called, "where did you go last night? We were worried." She tilted her head, still smiling that horrible smile. "I went for a walk. The forest is beautiful in the dark." "Without your boots?" Her head tilted further at an angle that would have been painful for a human neck. "I don't need boots anymore." Sarah had reached her now, was embracing her with tears of relief, but over Sarah's shoulder I could see Megan's hands as they patted her friend's back. The fingernails were too long, stained black, and they curved like claws. "We should go," Not Megan said, pulling back from Sarah's embrace, "before it gets dark again." She led us deeper into the forest, down paths that seemed to appear beneath her feet. Sarah followed eagerly, chattering about how worried we'd been, how glad she was that Megan was safe. But I noticed things that made my skin crawl. Megan's feet made no sound as they touched the ground. When she brushed against hanging moss, it withered and blackened at her touch. And once, when she turned to smile at us over her shoulder, I saw that her teeth were too sharp, filed to points like a predator's. "Sarah," I whispered, grabbing her arm, "that's not Megan." "Don't be ridiculous," Sarah snapped, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty. "Of course it's her. Who else would it be?" Ahead of us, Not Megan had stopped walking. Her head turned toward us with that same unnatural tilt, and her smile grew even wider. "Jennifer doesn't trust me," she said in Megan's voice. "That hurts my feelings." "I just think we should be careful," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You disappeared without a trace. You're not wearing shoes in a swamp. And you're acting different." "Different? How?" The thing wearing Megan's face took a step toward me, and I could smell something rotten on its breath like meat left too long in the sun. "You haven't blinked once since we found you." For a moment, its expression flickered as if it were trying to remember how human faces were supposed to work. Then it blinked, a slow, deliberate movement that looked more like a reptile than a person. "Better?" it asked. Sarah was looking between us now, confusion and growing fear warring in her expression. "Megan, what's going on? You're scaring me." "I'm not scaring anyone," Not Megan said, and its voice began to change, becoming rougher, less human. "I'm just trying to get you home." "Home where?" I demanded. Its smile became something terrible. "My home." That's when Sarah finally understood. She stumbled backward, her face pale with terror, but Not Megan moved faster than any human could. Its hand, now obviously clawed, lashed out and caught Sarah's wrist. "Let her go," I screamed, grabbing a fallen branch and swinging it at the thing's head. The branch passed right through its skull as if it were made of smoke. Not Megan turned its horrible smile on me. Sarah's wrist still caught in its impossible grip. "Jennifer," it said in Megan's voice, "don't you want to see where your friend really went?" The forest around us began to change, the trees seeming to bend and twist, their branches reaching down like grasping fingers. The ground beneath our feet turned soft and spongy, and I realized with horror that we were sinking. "The hollow," Not Megan continued, dragging Sarah deeper into the nightmare landscape. "It's hungry. It's been hungry for so long." I could see bones now, white and scattered, half buried in the moss and decay. Human bones, old and yellowed, some still wearing scraps of clothing from decades past. The logging camp that had been abandoned overnight in the 1920s. The workers hadn't left at all. "What did you do with Megan?" I sobbed, still trying to follow to somehow save Sarah. "She's here," the thing said, and for a moment its face shifted, showing me glimpses of my friend underneath, terrified, screaming silently, trapped inside this walking nightmare. "She's always here, like all the rest." The ground gave way completely, and we fell into darkness that had weight and texture, darkness that writhed and whispered with voices that had been screaming for nearly a century. I hit the bottom hard, my headlamp flickering to life and illuminating a cavern that couldn't exist, walls lined with cocoons that might have been tree roots or might have been something else entirely, something that pulsed with a rhythm like a massive, buried heart. Sarah was on the ground beside me, unconscious but breathing. Above us, Not Megan floated down through the darkness like a falling leaf, its form shifting and changing, sometimes human, sometimes something with too many teeth and too many joints. "Welcome home," it said with Megan's voice, and I could hear my friend screaming inside the words. The cocoons began to split open. What emerged defied description. Things that had once been human but had been changed, twisted, made into something else. I saw the remains of a logging camp uniform, a dress from the 1940s, clothing from every decade since the Hollow had begun feeding. They moved toward us with hungry, desperate movements, their faces showing the same terrible smile. I grabbed Sarah's shoulders and shook her awake. Her eyes opened, unfocused and terrified, taking in the impossible cavern around us. "We have to run," I whispered. But there was nowhere to go. The walls pressed in around us, alive and shifting, and the things that had once been people surrounded us with their reaching hands and predatory smiles. Not Megan drifted closer, its form stabilizing back into something resembling our friend. "Don't fight it," it said gently. "It doesn't hurt for long, and then you'll be part of something beautiful, something eternal." I could see Megan's real face flickering behind the mask, her eyes wide with terror and pleading. The thing was using her as a puppet, wearing her like a disguise, and somewhere inside that twisted form, my friend was still alive and aware. That's when I remembered something Megan had told us on our first camping trip together, years ago. A piece of folklore her grandfather had shared. Fire drives back the dark, but only if it burns true. My lighter was still in my pocket. With shaking hands, I pulled it out and flicked it to life. The flame burned normal and orange in the cavern air, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The things surrounding us hissed and drew back, their borrowed faces twisting with pain. "That won't help you," Not Megan said, but I could hear uncertainty in its voice for the first time. I reached into my pack and pulled out the liquid fuel for our camp stove, spilling it across the cavern floor. The fumes made me dizzy in the confined space, but I could see the things retreating further, their forms becoming less solid. "Sarah, when I say run, head for that tunnel," I whispered, pointing to a narrow opening in the cavern wall that might lead back to the surface. I dropped the lighter. The flames roared to life, blue and orange and searingly bright in the darkness. The things that had been people screamed and began to dissolve, their stolen forms melting back into shadow. "Not," Megan shrieked, its careful disguise falling away to reveal something ancient and hungry, all teeth and darkness and malevolent intelligence. But as it writhed in the flames, I saw Megan's true face one last time, grateful and loving and free. "Run!" I screamed, and Sarah and I sprinted for the tunnel as the cavern collapsed behind us. We crawled through darkness that seemed to go on forever, our hands and knees torn by sharp rocks, our lungs burning from smoke and terror. But finally, impossibly, I saw light ahead. Real sunlight, warm and golden and beautiful. We emerged from a crack in the earth I swear hadn't been there when we'd set up camp, blinking in the late afternoon sun like creatures returning from the dead. My watch was working again, showing 4:17 p.m. on what my phone claimed was still Saturday, though it felt like we'd been underground for days. "The cars," Sarah gasped, pointing through the trees. Our vehicles were exactly where we'd left them, covered in what looked like days of dust and fallen leaves. We ran to them without looking back, started the engines with shaking hands, and drove away from that place as fast as the forest roads would allow. We never spoke about what happened in the hollow. We never went camping together again. Sarah moved across the country 6 months later, and we only exchange Christmas cards now. Some experiences break the bonds between people, leaving cracks that can never be healed. I still have nightmares about that smile, about things wearing the faces of people I love, moving through dark forests with hungry intentions. Sometimes I wake up to find my apartment too quiet, too still, and I have to turn on every light to convince myself I'm still in the real world. But the worst dreams are the ones where I'm back in that cavern, watching my friend's face flicker behind a mask of malevolence, knowing that somewhere in the Francis Marion National Forest, something ancient and terrible is still waiting for the next group of hikers to lose their way. Sometimes, late at night when the darkness presses against my windows, I swear I can hear crying in the distance. A little girl's voice, soft and mournful, calling for help. And I know better than to follow it home.